Hey everyone, welcome back. Chapters 891 through 900 of the previous episode. Continuing his journey, Qian Ping'an rescues Sui Jingcheng from a treacherous marriage trap orchestrated by scheming cultivators. After a friendly spar with a top-tier martial artist, he single-handedly slaughters a wave of elite assassins to protect her. Eventually, he befriends the like-minded cultivator Qi Jinglong, who agrees to guard him as he prepares to refine a crucial 5-element bonded item. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 901-5. The Dragon Gate tier Guemo and Duckweed Sword Lake's Rongchang both looked toward the young man who had just exited seclusion. Guemo felt slightly astonished. This was a lower 5-tier cultivator refining his bonded item, so it wasn't reasonable for the commotion and aura to be so great. Rongchang was a nascent tier sword cultivator who stood even higher and could see even further, so he wasn't just astonished, and he even felt a little stunned. Qi Jinglong didn't turn around, and he retracted the small world formed by his bonded flying sword. His flying sword hadn't been visible when he had summoned the small world, and it wasn't visible now either, now that he was retracting his small world. Sorry for the impoliteness, Qi Jinglong said to Rongchang. Rongchang was from Duckweed Sword Lake, and with Sword Immortal Li Kai being his master, it was difficult for him and the other internal disciples to suffer hardship and dissatisfaction, even if they wanted to. As such, Rongchang didn't feel offended as he smiled and said, "It's my great honor and fortune to personally experience the power of Mr. Lu's bonded flying sword. If the opportunity arises in the future, why don't we find a place to spar to our heart's content? As long as it's not at Temper Mountain," Qi Jinglong replied with a smile. Qian Ping'an walked over to stand beside Qi Jinglong, and when he brushed past Sui Jingcheng, he said in a quiet voice, "There's no need to worry." Sui Jingcheng felt much more reassured after hearing this. It was as if the senior sword immortal's appearance was more reassuring than Mr. Lu's bonded flying sword. This was the case even though she already knew that the senior sword immortal was only a lower 5-tier cultivator, with his cultivation base temporarily lower than that of Qi Jinglong. Qian Ping'an stood beside Qi Jinglong and said, "Thanks. Don't persuade me to drink wine if you truly want to thank me," Qi Jinglong replied. "Easy done," Qian Ping'an said with a smile. Afterward, Qi Jinglong roughly recounted the events, naturally leaving out the sensitive secrets that couldn't be revealed. Meanwhile, Qian Ping'an had needed to remain fully focused when refining his bonded item, so he was unclear about what Qi Jinglong and the others had been discussing. Even so, he had been able to roughly sense the tension over at the Lotus Pond, especially when Qi Jinglong had summoned his bonded flying sword. Qian Ping'an had managed to clearly sense this even though he had been fully immersed in refining his bonded item. However, the aura of this flying sword had possessed good affinity with Qian Ping'an's mental state, so not only did it not detrimentally affect his refinement, but it was as if Qi Jinglong were providing further help to his cause. Qian Ping'an turned around and said to Sui Jingcheng, "You can return to your room first. It won't be helpful for you to learn some things too early. Mr. Lu and I need to discuss a few things with Celestial Maiden Gu and Sword Immortal Rong first, so make sure not to eavesdrop on our conversation. This pertains to the direction of your great Tao, and it's not something that can be treated carelessly." Sui Jingcheng nodded in understanding before directly returning to her room. Rongchang felt slightly solemn when he saw this. After Sui Jingcheng lightly closed her door, there was no time for Qian Ping'an to even speak before Qi Jinglong silently set up a formation, blocking all of the sound and images from her room. His movements were casual and smooth. They were also extremely quick and stable. Qian Ping'an seemingly didn't show any signs of wanting to warn Qi Jinglong about anything, and he had already turned around to face the two esteemed immortals from the mountains the moment that Sui Jingcheng had closed her door and Qi Jinglong had set up his talismanic formation, asking, "Can Mr. Lu and I sit down to have a conversation with the two of you? We might not be able to reach a consensus very quickly, however." "Feel free," Guemo replied with a nod. Qian Ping'an sat on the long bench behind Qi Jinglong, following which Qi Jinglong also sat down. However, he shuffled slightly to the side, no longer sitting in the middle like before. From the beginning to the end, Qi Jinglong had simply stood up, calmly spoken reason, summoned his bonded flying sword, and then retracted his bonded flying sword. Rongchang's heart sank even further when the two young men in azure sat down. How did the two of them possess such a strong mental affinity? There was even a notion of principle and reason regarding how they were seated on the bench. While searching for Sui Jingcheng, Rongchang and Guemo had also conducted a thorough investigation on Chen Ping'an, the so-called Golden Courtier sword immortal, beyond the bits and pieces revealed through the newspapers. There were many leads, yet most of them were disorderly, making things confusing and difficult to grasp. As for Lu Jinglong, there was no need for the two of them to investigate anything. He was the terrestrial flood dragon, ranked third among the 10 most powerful young cultivators in the northern complete reed continent. He was a supreme prodigy from the northern region's Great Emblem Sword sect, who had rapidly ascended to lofty heights. 2 sword immortals from the Great Emblem Sword sect had already traveled to the faraway Stalactite Mountain, and this was an extremely dangerous situation for a sect-level immortal force, especially one in the northern complete reed continent where a single disagreement could lead to a life-and-death conflict. Powerful immortal forces that had sword cultivators as their backbones all had a decent number of enemies in the mountains. However, no one would underestimate the Great Emblem Sword sect, even with their 2 sword immortals no longer present in the region. Those with weaker cultivation bases didn't dare to underestimate the Great Emblem Sword sect, while those with higher cultivation bases were unwilling to underestimate the Great Emblem Sword sect. Of the 2 sword immortals who went to the Sword Chi Great Wall, one was the sect leader of the Great Emblem Sword sect, but he wasn't Lu Jinglong's Dao mentor. The other sword immortal was even more senior, but he wasn't Lu Jinglong's Dao guardian either. Rather, the person who had the honor of being Lu Jinglong's Dao guardian was one of his senior sisters, yet she didn't have a place in the list of top 10 cultivators of the northern complete reed continent. This was because she had already been at the peak stage of the Golden Courtier when Lu Jinglong had first entered the mountain, yet she was still at the same cultivation base now that Lu Jinglong had made a name for himself. Even though the Great Emblem Sword sect tried to suppress the news, there were still lingering rumors claiming that the Golden Courtier sword cultivator, whom the sword sect had very high hopes for, had almost fallen to demonic ways during her cultivation. In the end, Lu Jinglong had personally helped her through the challenging situation, suffering severe wounds in the process. Meanwhile, Lu Jinglong's Dao mentor was merely an elderly Dragon Gate tier sword cultivator in the sect. Due to the limit of his talent, he had already suffered the pitiful fate of having his great Dao slowly decay and crumble, eventually leading to his passing. Looking back at this now, this was an extremely strange matter to begin with, yet everything had appeared very reasonable at the time. This was because Lu Jinglong wasn't a genuine innate sword talent, and during the early stages of his cultivation, almost no one in the Great Emblem Sword sect or other immortal forces had imagined that he would advance at such a rapid pace. A sword immortal who had a good relationship with the Great Emblem Sword sect had once voiced his puzzlement when Lu Jinglong had advanced to the abode tier, and been given the honor of becoming one of the very few direct disciples of the Ancestral Hall. He was worried about Lu Jinglong's personality being too soft, which was in stark contrast to the sword Dao tenets of the Great Emblem Sword sect. This would make it very difficult for Lu Jinglong to reach great heights and achieve great feats, and it would be especially difficult for him to become a pillar of the sect. Of course, reality proved that the Great Emblem Sword sect's decision to make an exception and allow Lu Jinglong to become a direct disciple of the Ancestral Hall was as correct as could be. Chen Ping'an looked at the female cultivator from the Profound Dawn branch and said, "I'm an outsider, and I'm sure that your investigations have already told you this. In reality, I come from the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, and rescuing Sui Jingcheng was only a coincidence. Can you explain in more detail?" Rongchang asked. Chen Ping'an nodded in response and roughly explained the conflict that had taken place at the pavilion. Of course, he naturally didn't mention anything about observing people to cultivate the mind, and he steered even further away from discussing the concepts of good people and bad people. Instead, he only mentioned the final actions of the people in the pavilion. To say nothing of Duckweed Sword Lake's Rongchang, even the short-tempered Guemo wasn't worried about this person telling lies. This was because the young man in azure was sitting beside Lu Jinglong. Even upper 5-tier cultivators might utter a huge number of lies, with their unreliable words potentially carrying deadly dangers. However, Lu Jinglong definitely wouldn't tell such lies. This person was able to become Lu Jinglong's friend, so he most likely wouldn't tell such lies either. This was a formless principle and an intangible rule. This was the case even if Lu Jinglong simply sat there without uttering a single word. I made a worst-case prediction before, speculating that you had tricked Sui Jingqing into following you and loyally cultivating with you. After all, Sui Jingqing is still inexperienced regarding these worldly matters, yet possesses extremely valuable treasures. The Golden Scale Palace's actions were crude and a waste of talent, so we actually weren't worried at all after learning of this matter. On the other hand, what we witnessed just then had the potential to cause us the biggest headaches. Rong Chong paused for a moment before saying honestly. However, Mr. Chan was unexpectedly able to guess the secret regarding Sui Jingqing's Dao mentorship, even leaving her an option that favored the two of us. By the looks of it, I was being too pessimistic with my initial assessment. I've already explained my side of the story, so can the two of you explain your side now? You can leave out any sensitive secrets, Chun Ping'an asked. Rong Chong and Guemo exchanged a glance, with both of them feeling slightly conflicted. Guemo gracefully jumped onto the small boat in the lotus pond and sat down cross-legged, surprisingly pushing all of the responsibility onto Rong Chong as she said, "You can discuss this with them, Sword Immortal Rong. I'm not good with these complicated and roundabout matters. They're annoying as heck." Rong Chong felt slightly helpless. In reality, he couldn't accuse Guemo of being unreasonable for wiping her hands of this matter. After all, the profound Dawn Primordial Lord had been helping his master, Sword Immortal Li Kai, by giving Sui Jingqing those fated opportunities. To be more precise, Li Yu had been helping the future leader of Duckweed Sword Lake. This was because Li Kai would definitely travel to Stalactite Mountain in the future, and the only reason she had stayed back at the Northern Complete Reed continent was because she had wanted to wait for the profound Dawn Primordial Lord to exit seclusion first. At that time, the two of them could travel to the Sword Chi Great Wall together to slay great demons. Now that Li Yu had unfortunately passed away, Li Kai would most likely still travel to Stalactite Mountain by herself. Moreover, she had already said before that the future leader of Duckweed Sword Lake wouldn't be Rong Chong, even if he became an upper 5-tier sword immortal. The other experienced and relatively talented elders of Duckweed Sword Lake would assume the position of leader either. Instead, this was a position reserved for his junior sister, who had already been cultivating in seclusion for 30 years. In other words, the Jade person of the Sui clan, from the Five Mountain Nation. Rong Chong didn't feel any resentment or have any complaints about this. He believed that the cultivators of Duckweed Sword Lake all felt the same way. The reason for this was very simple. They were obviously afraid of sect leader Li Kai smacking them to death with a single palm strike. As for the Profound Dawn branch, it was said that Li Yu was skilled in several mystical abilities, with people claiming that these were Dao inheritances from spiritual master Fire Dragon. His junior sister's true body was genuinely cultivating in seclusion and comprehending Dao at Duckweed Sword Lake, but with the help of the Profound Dawn Primordial Lord's mystical ability, she was able to achieve something similar to having her own soul leave her body and travel around the world, reincarnating into Sui Jingqing. This wouldn't injure her actual soul at all, so it could be said that Sui Jingqing was indeed still the daughter of old Assistant Minister Sui Sinyu. However, she wasn't a complete person. In any case, she was currently in a mystical state that made Rong Chong develop a headache every time he tried to think a little deeper about it. As for the final outcome, and regarding how his junior sister could take advantage of this to practice the sword, Rong Chong had already given up on trying to figure out these matters. His master, Li Kai, hadn't said much about this at the time, and she had seemingly still been withholding a lot of information. Regardless, Rong Chang's task was to suppress and eliminate the small mishap over at Sui Jingqing's side. A mishap that was caused by the large and unexpected mishap of the Profound Dawn Primordial Lord passing away while cultivating in seclusion. He needed to keep Sui Jingqing in the Northern Complete Reed continent and wait for his master to return from another continent. That way, Rong Chong would be spared from punishment after his master arrived back at the sect. As for the Golden Scale Palace, Chao Fu and whatnot, he had never even heard of these useless bastards before. Rong Chong felt like he would be dirtying his hands if he drew his sword to deal with these measly beings. After mulling over these matters for a moment, Rong Chong was still unwilling to reveal too much. The two people in front of him liked to speak reason and were good at speaking reason, but if he dared to treat them like fools because of this, then the true fool would end up being himself. If he revealed some small clues, Perhaps these two people would be able to follow them to uncover even more truths. In the end, these two outsiders might even be able to see more and see further than him. They wouldn't necessarily threaten him or blackmail him with this information, but it would ultimately still be a bad outcome. There were two things that were most unacceptable at Duckweed Sword Lake: being bad with the sword and being too stupid. Of course, everyone was a fool with terrible sword skills in the eyes of his master, Li Kai. Each time she got angry and physically punished her students, she couldn't help but remark at the same time, "If you're slow and stupid, then you should at least practice the sword as if your life depends on it. Yet, you still have the gall to slack off." What kind of reasoning was this? And thus, Rongchang carefully mulled over his words before saying, "Things have already come to this, so the most important thing right now is how to resolve the current dilemma. Sui Jingcheng is clearly attached to Mr. Chun already, and severing one's romantic feelings with the sword of wisdom is easier said than done. It can't be said that no one has succeeded in using tribulations of romance to temper their sword skills, but only a very small number of sword cultivators have succeeded." Chun Ping'an nodded and concurred. That's indeed the case. During his time in the Lotus Flower-blessed land, the Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei, or Jiang Shangzhen to be exact, had employed all kinds of techniques for the sake of helping his friend Lu Feng untie the knot of romance in his heart. Many of his actions had been shocking, and they could already be regarded as some of the most cold-hearted actions in the world. Even so, the outcome had still been far from ideal. Lu Feng had ultimately failed to gain a spot among the upper 10 elites, even losing to Chun Ping'an in the process. In reality, the most important reason was Lu Feng's mental state failing to reach a state of completeness and perfection. As such, he would have essentially wasted 60 years of his life even if he had managed to transcend and leave the Lotus Flower-blessed land. I'm not accusing Mr. Chun of anything, and I'm simply focusing on the reality of the current situation. Mr. Chun has tied the knot in Sui Jingqing's heart, so are you willing to untie it now? Rongchang asked. That's quite difficult, Chun Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. Rongchang frowned upon hearing this. Guemo, who had initially planned to remain silent, couldn't help but exclaim, "What kind of attitude is this? Cultivators indulging in beautiful women are stooping to a very low level. Or perhaps you have even greater plans, and you want to become immortal Dao partners with Sui Jingcheng? And that way, you'll essentially gain a relationship with the profound Dawn Branch and Duckweed Sword Lake? Goodness me, what an impressive plan." However, Chun Ping'an shook his head again and said, "That's not the case." Some words were very unpleasant to the ear. However, being willing to utter these words was actually not a bad thing. Truly unpleasant remarks were always hiding in people's minds or hiding in the shadowy corners. People would speak in a taunting manner and utter some so-called fair remarks, and it was these seemingly harmless words that were the most repulsive. This is a very difficult situation, Qi Jinglong concurred with a nod. Let me raise some possibilities, Chun Ping'an suddenly said. I'll talk about the two extremes first. As Buddhism spread east, it gradually split into Mahayana Buddhism and Hinayana Buddhism. Rather than overcoming self-attachment, it was better to have no self-attachment at all. When Sui Jingcheng successfully cultivates her mind, her attachments of today will become the indifference of tomorrow. That will be a true case of severing her romantic attachments. Of course, the other extreme is Sui Jingcheng's feelings being extremely deep-rooted. So much so that they continue to linger in her mind even if she's tens of thousands of kilometers away from me. Her feelings might be difficult to sever even if she manages to become an upper 5-tier sword immortal. Now, taking a look between these two extremes, the two of you are both mighty figures from sec-level immortal forces, so you probably know some mystical abilities that specifically target romantic tribulations and sever romantic ties. However, I feel like we also need to look after Sui Jingqing's feelings and mental state. Guemo could feel a headache forming again and she exclaimed, Can you speak more directly and say what we need to do? Is there any need to waffle on like this? Chun Ping'an looked toward her and said, This is only a matter of acting once or twice for you, but for Sui Jingcheng, this is something that will decide the direction of her great Tao and the limit of her achievements. That being the case, does it hurt for us to chat for a short while longer? In fact, what does it matter even if we have to chat for several more days? Those cultivating in the mountains become oblivious to the cycling seasons in the mortal world. So is this short amount of time truly too much to ask of you? If it weren't Mr. Lu and me here right now, and if it were two cultivators at the same cultivation base as Mr. Lu instead, then perhaps the two of you would have already retreated from this courtyard with severe wounds. Not wounded but dead, Qi Jinglong corrected in a calm voice. Do you know how to speak properly? Chen Ping'an asked in exasperation. Please continue, Qi Jinglong said. Chen Ping'an retrieved 2 pots of wine, tossing one to Qi Jinglong and cracking open the other himself to take a sip. Qi Jinglong simply held the pot of wine in his hand, not cracking it open to enjoy. He genuinely didn't like to drink wine. Rongchang smiled upon hearing Qi Jinglong's remarks. His words were quite unpleasant to the ear. However, his reasoning was spot on. Rongchang was fairly capable of accepting these harsh truths. On the other hand, Guemo was most likely feeling quite dissatisfied. Sure enough, she immediately stood up and exclaimed with a cold chuckle. Would I have joined the Profound Dawn branch if I were cowardly and afraid of death? Would I leave the mountains to vanquish demons and slay fiends? Why not just hide in the mountains to cultivate and save myself the trouble? That way I wouldn't need to deal with people like you either. Even if I die, I'm nothing more than a Dragon Gate tier cultivator. However, the Northern Complete Reed continent will also lose 2 bastards who have a higher cultivation base than me. Who's losing and who's winning in this exchange? Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before asking. Aren't you personally losing as well? Losing your head? Guemo cursed loudly. Chen Ping'an didn't get angry at all, and he turned around and chuckled. Your cultivation base is higher, so why don't you reason with the 2 of them instead? Qi Jinglong smiled faintly and suggested. Your temper is better, so it makes more sense for you to reason with them. The sleeves of Gumo's Profound Dawn Dao robe billowed violently, with her expression livid as she shouted. Enough with the bullshit. One of you can get the fuck over here to fight with me. Any one of you will do. Your immortal sect is too powerful, so I don't dare to fight with you, Chen Ping'an responded. Guemo chuckled in anger and replied. I'm not crazy, so I'll only spar with you and not fight to the death. Qi Jinglong smiled faintly and remarked. So you're purposely picking on the weak. This isn't very good. Guemo didn't feel embarrassed at all, and she said with confidence, I would accept death if I were slaying demons and vanquishing fiends. However, this is nothing more than a sparring session, so wouldn't I be seeking humiliation if I challenged you, Lu Jinglong? Guemo then looked toward the lower 5-tier cultivator and continued. You've been disguising yourself as a golden core tier sword cultivator this entire time, and you also engaged in several intense conflicts recently, even defeating the Vajrabadi tier martial artist from the Great Guan Empire. In fact, you even managed to kill that saber-wielding cultivator called Xiaoshai or whatnot. By the looks of it, you aren't a pushover at all. In any case, the sparring session is between us and not between our immortal forces. A look of puzzlement quickly spread over Gumo's face as she asked, Are the 2 of you mumbling about something? Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, I was asking Mr. Lu whether your Dao robe could block the full power strike of an Earth Immortal Sword cultivator, and it's because of this that you're so confident. Mr. Lu replied that this is naturally the case. How utterly shameless! Guemo roared in rage. Rongchang pinched his glabella. What in the world was going on? If he had known that this matter would become so difficult, he would have let someone else leave Duckweed Sword Lake to deal with it. The immortal ship that was heading from Dragonhead Ferry Station to Skeleton Shoal in the south slowly rose into the air, with the horizon in the distance decorated with the soft red glow of dusk. Guemo leaned against the railing and silently shed tears. Her master had once said that her biggest wish was to ascend amid the dusk glow. Guemo had still been a young and naive girl back then, so she had asked her master what was so good about ascending. At the time, her master had simply gazed at the dusk glow in the sky, not explaining anything to the young girl. Guemo wasn't sad about losing her backer or whatnot. When it came to Taoist priests and Taoist nuns from the Profound Dawn branch, they wouldn't complain to their masters and seniors as long as they were able to return home alive after slaying demons and vanquishing fiends. Sui Jingcheng stood beside Guemo. Rongchang didn't appear, but Qi Jinglong was standing not too far away. This was because the immortal ship was traveling south in the same direction, with the route of the vessel passing over the territory of the Great Seal Script Empire. However, Qi Jinglong quickly returned to his room. On the ground, Chen Ping'an was dressed in azure and walking north on foot, making his way to the end of the river where it flowed into the sea. Guemo and Sui Jingcheng were staying in neighboring rooms on the immortal ship, and Guemo had already recovered at this moment, boldly following Sui Jingcheng into her room and pouring herself a cup of tea, making herself feel at home. She completely ignored Sui Jingcheng's expression, which was clearly saying that she wanted to cultivate alone right now. Guemo smiled widely, thinking to herself that Sui Jingcheng obviously couldn't calm down and cultivate with how chaotic her mental state was right now. Sui Jingcheng wouldn't be able to fool anyone. Did that young man with the surname Chan not give you any tokens of love? Guemo asked. Sui Jingcheng ignored the words of this female cultivator who had no filter. Guemo glanced at the basically refined hiking pole in Sui Jingcheng's hands, and she was easily able to see through Chan Pingan's crude illusion technique with her Dragon Gate tier cultivation base. This is all? Its quality is fairly good, and its appearance is also okay. However, with how beautiful you are, that man with the surname Chan clearly isn't showing any sincerity. I'm not criticizing you or anything, Sui Jingcheng, but you shouldn't fall for that man's smooth and flowery words. Sui Jingcheng took off her veiled hat and placed the hiking pole on the table. She then sat opposite Guemo and rested her arms and head on the table. Guemo clicked her tongue in wonder as she looked the jade person of the Sui clan up and down. Regardless of whether they spoke or not, genuinely beautiful women in the world would still be a stunning sight to behold. Sui Jingcheng would only become more beautiful when she advanced to the middle 5 tiers. Just how incredible would that be? Guemo couldn't resist the temptation to extend her hand, wanting to stroke Sui Jingcheng's soft and supple cheek. Sui Jingcheng immediately swatted Gumo's hand aside, straightening her back and sitting upright as she exclaimed with a frown, "Please conduct yourself with dignity, celestial maiden Gu." Guemo rolled her eyes and downed her cup of tea in a single gulp. She then put down her cup and asked in a soft voice, "I heard that you traveled across several nations with that young man with the surname Chan. How did you bathe when the two of you camped in the wilderness? And you haven't stopped your periods yet, have you? One wasn't that troublesome. Celestial Maiden Gu is an immortal cultivator, so it's not appropriate for you to ask this kind of question, is it?" Guemo grinned and replied, "Cultivators are still humans, no? And female cultivators are still females, no? I don't need to spend a single snowflake coin to ask these questions, nor do you need to lose a single snowflake coin to answer them. So why don't you clear up my confusion? Senior is a virtuous and upright person, and I'm only going to say this a single time, Celestial Maiden Gu. I don't want to hear these kinds of remarks ever again." Sui Jingcheng replied in a solemn voice. Guemo feigned a look of terror and stammered, "Will you ask Sword Immortal Rong to hack me to death if you get angry?" She then forcefully banged her head into the table and fell forward, sprawling herself across the table and flailing her arms around as she wailed, "Please don't do that. I'm scared of dying." There was a knock on the door, and Rong Cheng's voice traveled over saying, "It's me." Sui Jingcheng felt extremely relieved and she hurriedly said, "Please come in." Guemo had already adjusted her posture, sitting upright and drinking tea slowly. Rong Chong was seemingly accustomed to this already, and he sat down and said to Sui Jingcheng, "We're going to travel to Skeleton Shoal in the southernmost region of the northern complete reed continent now, and we'll cross continents and travel to the eastern treasured vial continent after that. I'll explain some taboos of the mountains to you, and this might be slightly complicated. However, there's nothing we can do about this. Even though the eastern treasured vial continent is the smallest continent in the majestic world, there might still be many incredible and peculiar individuals in this region. As such, we still need to adhere to their traditions and customs." Rong Chong actually felt slightly awkward. His temper couldn't be regarded as good among those from Duckweed Sword Lake, and he only appeared friendly and approachable compared to his master, Li Kai. Regarding Rong Chang's true temper, the cultivators who had been killed or wounded by his sword were the most clear. Rong Chong was an extremely influential nascent tier sword cultivator in the central region of the northern complete reed continent, and he actually had a few direct disciples at Duckweed Sword Lake as well. There was a popular saying outside the mountains, saying that sticks and rods would produce dutiful children. Rong Chong followed a similar principle, positing that a few extra sword strikes would advance his disciples' cultivation. Of course, he was naturally much more patient towards Sui Jingcheng, who could be regarded as half a junior sister. Sui Jingqing patiently listened to Rongchang's lecture-like explanation. Guemo wasn't an outsider, so Rongchang didn't shoo her away. She didn't have the self-awareness to voluntarily leave either. As such, she simply sat there and drank cup after cup of tea, occasionally yawning as she listened to Rongchang rambling on. Even so, she preferred to listen to his boring explanations rather than returning to her room and wallowing in boredom by herself. Rongchang breathed a sigh of relief. Sui Jingqing had seemingly learned many rules and regulations of the mountains from Chan Ping'an. Moreover, she was indeed a bit different from the junior sister whom he was familiar with. His junior sister had the best temper out of everyone at Duckweed Sword Lake, yet she also had the worst temper at the same time. When she was in a good mood, she could teach the junior sword techniques for a very long time, showing even more patience and commitment than their Dao mentors. When she was in a bad mood, however, even Master Li Kai would be powerless against her. After returning from training in the outside world one time, Rongchang's junior sister had felt like she wasn't wrong, while Master Li Kai had felt like she was more correct. After a heated argument, his junior sister had been suppressed and restrained by their enraged master, having her cultivation base reduced to the abode tier. Afterward, she had been locked under Duckweed Sword Lake for 6 entire months. She had already been on the verge of death when she was dragged ashore, and Master Li Kai had asked her whether she admitted to her mistakes. However, Rongchang's junior sister had remarked that the scenery at the bottom of the lake was unmatched, and that she hadn't enjoyed it for long enough yet. In the end, their master had looked around with an ice-cold gaze, and as her opening disciple, Rongchang had been left with no option but to step forward. Of course, he hadn't forgotten to use his mind's voice to tell several other junior brothers and junior sisters to step forward as well, with all of them saying that they were willing to face punishment in place of their junior sister. Only then did Master Li Kai go with the flow and reward them with 1 sword strike each, leaving the lake after she vented some of her anger. Afterward, Rongchang had almost been hunted and beaten up by his junior brothers and junior sisters, causing him to feel extremely stifled, especially since he couldn't reveal the secret. In the end, he could only flee from Duckweed Sword Lake to wait out the commotion. At the time, Sword Immortal Li Kai had specifically singled him out, using her mind's voice to instruct him to step forward and accept punishment, showcasing his demeanor as everyone's senior brother. What could Rongchang do? His master's skill in making life difficult for people was no inferior to her skills with the sword, huh? At the end of the day, however, Duckweed Sword Lake was still a very good place. For example, there was an unwritten rule in the ancestral hall of Duckweed Sword Lake, stating, "Disciples are not allowed to use their identities as sword cultivators of Duckweed Sword Lake when leaving the mountains to practice their sword skills. Disciples can follow the below 3 steps if they come across foes whom they can't defeat. First step, run. Second step, if running fails, then announce the name of Duckweed Sword Lake's Li Kai. Third step, if Li Kai's name is ineffective, then don't forget to use the Ancestral Hall's talismanic sword to record and send over the enemy's name. When your soul is laid to rest at the Sex Sword burial ground in the future, it will definitely be accompanied by the head of the enemy." Rongchang naturally wished that his junior sister could advance even further and become the second Sword Immortal Li Kai at Duckweed Sword Lake. As for himself, the chances were quite slim. After advancing to the nascent tier, he was actually aware of how much further he could advance already. Those who form a golden core will become one of us. However, beyond the great fortune of successfully forming a golden core, an even clearer division would appear at the same time. This was similar to the scholars who participated in the imperial exams in the mortal empires. Some would become ecstatic simply by progressing to the final examination, feeling like they were living in a dream and enjoying the blessings of their ancestors. In fact, they would continue to feel a great sense of achievement for dozens of years afterward. These people were like vagrant cultivators, and they were like the so-called 1-in-several-hundred-year cultivation prodigies in the small immortal forces. Some would place among the second class, with some of these scholars feeling delighted and some still feeling disappointed. These people were quite like the official immortals of large immortal forces. Some would place in the first class, obtaining the titles of second or third. They would feel like this was deserved, yet there was still a slight blemish due to not coming first. This was a very small group of people, and they were like the direct disciples of sec-level forces. And finally, some would place first and obtain the title of champion scholar. The only reason they couldn't place higher was because this was already the highest rank. Lu Jinglong could be regarded as one such person. As for the two so-called young cultivators who were ranked above Lu Jinglong, they very obviously belonged to the last category of cultivators as well. Guemo, Lu Jinglong's senior sister, and Rongchang were all at different cultivation bases right now. But their final achievements in cultivation would most likely be very similar. They could dream of advancing to the unpolished jade tier, but nothing more than this. Sword Immortal Rong, is the Golden Scale Palace on the way? Sui Jingcheng suddenly changed the topic and asked. It's not on the way, but we can take a detour to go there, Rongchang replied with a smile. Sui Jingcheng felt slightly puzzled. Perhaps they were going to soar on the wind to travel to the Golden Scale Palace, following which they hurriedly chased after the immortal ship to re-embark? All it takes is a healthy sum of money, Rongchang explained. The stewards of the immortal ship will agree, and we only need to provide some compensation to the other passengers. In any case, the detour will only add a few extra days to the trip. What if the other passengers are unwilling to accept the compensation and take a detour? Sui Jingcheng asked. Rongchang smiled and replied, they should burn incense and count themselves lucky that they're receiving free money from a nascent tier sword cultivator. Sui Jingcheng shook her head in response. What I explained to you just then was largely the taboos and customs of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, Rongchang said with a serious expression. But we're still above the territory of the Northern Complete Reed Continent right now, and my suggestion adheres to the rules and regulations of the mountains here. Forget about it. I'll personally visit the Golden Scale Palace to seek justice when I achieve success in cultivation in the future, Sui Jingcheng replied with a smile. It was Rongchang's turn to shake his head. Guemo couldn't wipe the smile from her face. She had heard that there was seemingly an unknown nascent tier cultivator guarding the Golden Scale Palace, but their true combat power was definitely trash level compared to most other nascent tier cultivators. Even so, if Sui Jingcheng planned to resolve this grudge by herself, this implied that she needed to at least become a sword cultivator at the peak stage of the Golden Core tier first. When sword immortals sought revenge or challenged an immortal force, they would always arrive with nothing but their sword. They would make enemies with the entire immortal force, and they would shatter the mountain protection formation before breaking through the immortal treasure attacks of the cultivators. Only then would they do battle against the pillar cultivators of the immortal force. This was akin to a pure martial artist riding a horse and charging through a formation of heavy cavalry. This was no joke at all. Indeed, how many arrogant sword cultivators had lost their lives due to recklessly challenging an immortal force in the Northern Complete Reed Continent? Sui Jingcheng smiled faintly and said, I know this will take a very long time, but I don't mind. Rongchang thought to himself that this wouldn't necessarily be true. Sui Jingcheng simply needed to have her soul become complete, allowing her to once again become his junior sister from Duckweed Sword Lake. Sui Jingcheng hesitated for a moment before saying in a soft voice, Sword Immortal Rong, I feel like exercising caution is important when traveling around the outside world to train. It's better to be safe than sorry. Rongchang suppressed a smile and replied with a nod. Okay. Guemo also nodded in agreement, saying, We need to be careful, Sword Immortal Rong. We should heed the advice of those old sayings in the cultivation world. Sui Jingcheng ignored Gumo's teasing remark and continued, Sword Immortal Rong, your expression and demeanor sometimes give too much away when you look at the passengers of the immortal ship. Your cultivation base can be concealed, but some of your aura as a sword immortal is very difficult to hide. Those who are perceptive will inevitably become cautious and guarded, so if there are truly criminals present, then those at the abode tier will try their best to come together and elevate their combat power to the sea observation tier. Those at the sea observation tier will try their best to come together and elevate their combat power to the Dragon Gate tier, and so on and so forth. Small matters will become big matters, and big matters will become catastrophic matters. Sui Jingcheng thought for a moment before continuing with an embarrassed look. Perhaps I'm nervous and paranoid due to my low cultivation base, especially after encountering several dangers while traveling around the cultivation world. Sword Immortal Rong can simply regard me as a naive person who's spouting nonsense. The teasing smile disappeared from Gumo's face. This wasn't to say that Sui Jingcheng's reason was extremely correct and enough to convince Rongchang. Rather, Sui Jingcheng was an amateur cultivator who had only traveled around the cultivation world once in her life, yet she was already able to display such a mature temperament. In this sense, she was definitely more willing to use her brain than Guemo. Rongchang smiled faintly and replied, I naturally have my own plans. He was a nascent tier sword cultivator, after all, and he often traveled outside the mountains and had engaged in many life and death conflicts with cultivators at different cultivation bases. However, Sui Jingcheng's warning was very reasonable. By the looks of it, it wasn't entirely a bad thing for his junior sister to become Sui Jingcheng. His junior sister had caused huge trouble that time, causing the relationship between Duckweed Sword Lake and the Yang clan of the esteemed Mystery Department's lofty Cloud Palace to deteriorate. Sword Immortal Li Kai didn't allow her to leave the mountains and train outside again after imprisoning her under the lake for half a year, and his junior sister wasn't willing to leave the mountains anyway. However, she became more introverted after staying put at Duckweed Sword Lake to cultivate, and she completely stopped paying attention to outside matters. Afterward, the entire Duckweed Sword Lake started to feel a hint of panic, and even sect leader Li Kai was no exception. It wasn't that Rongchang's junior sister was suffering stagnation in her cultivation, but rather that her cultivation base was advancing far too quickly. In just a mere 20 years, she managed to break through the Dragon Gate tier and the Golden Core tier, directly advancing to the nascent tier. This was the fundamental reason behind Li Kai daring to claim that her prized disciple would definitely become one of the top 10 most powerful young cultivators in the Northern Complete Reed continent when the rankings were reassessed again in the future. However, even Rongchang was able to detect something amiss, having a nagging feeling that advancing so quickly would definitely leave many huge but hidden troubles for the future. Li Kai naturally had an even better understanding of this, and it was because of this that Rongchang's junior sister had been instructed to cultivate in seclusion, with the Profound Dawn Primordial Lord, Li Yu, secretly leaving the mountains and traveling to the Five Mountain Nation at the same time. On this day, Sui Jingcheng returned the golden hairpin with the characters Profound Dawn Commanding Ghost to Guemo. However, according to a secret agreement between her and Sword Immortal Li Kai, Guemo wouldn't bring this golden hairpin back to her immortal sect. Instead, she would hand it over to Rongchang, asking him to temporarily look after it. As for why this was, Guemo wasn't sure about the deeper reasoning. In any case, Sword Immortal Li Kai was very good friends with her master, Li Yu, and one of the flying swords that Guemo had refined was a relic left behind by a deceased Sword Immortal of Duckweed Sword Lake. Just as Chan Ping'an had speculated, Li Kai had gifted this sword to Guemo, so Guemo was extremely close to this female Sword Immortal, who was almost like a senior of her clan. After handing back the golden hairpin, Sui Jingcheng was finally able to obtain the final 2 volumes of the Upper Lofty Mystical Mystery. The first volume introduced the fundamental purpose of this cultivation technique, and by itself, it would be a useless secret scripture even in the hands of ordinary Earth immortals. Even so, Sui Jingcheng had somehow managed to advance to the peak stage of the second tier using nothing but this first volume. Because of this, even Rongchang felt like Sui Jingcheng's cultivation aptitude could be regarded as prodigious. The second volume started to properly introduce cultivation mantras, and it could be regarded as a legitimate Golden Core tier secret scripture. Meanwhile, the third and final volume introduced cultivation mantras critical for advancing to the upper 5 tiers. Rongchang also gave Sui Jingcheng a unique jade tablet from the ancestral hall of Duckweed Sword Lake, and not only did this jade tablet symbolize her status as a direct disciple, but it even doubled as a minimization treasure that only upper 5 tier cultivators would normally own. Indeed, Rongchang only had a pocket treasure and not a minimization treasure. The immortal ship traveled south, stopping briefly when it arrived at the Spring Dew Garden. Passengers could disembark and quickly wander around the immortal ferry station for approximately 4 hours. Qi Jinglong walked down the immortal ship, but more of the passengers chose to soar away on the wind. Guemo shamelessly followed behind the terrestrial flood dragon, continuing to ask him about the rumors pertaining to him in the mountains. When she returned home, just how envious would her love-struck junior sisters and senior sisters feel? It wasn't just the Profound Dawn branch that was like this, and many female cultivators in the secret Profound branch and the White Cloud branch felt immense admiration for this young sword immortal from the Great Emblem Sword sect as well, someone who appeared even more bookish than ordinary scholars even though he wasn't one. In fact, these female cultivators would almost start to drool at the mention of his name. After chattering in secret and turning around, they would immediately become cold and aloof in front of their junior brothers and senior brothers again, appearing as blunt as could be. These were extremely eye-opening experiences for Guemo. In any case, Guemo had already made up her mind, deciding that she would say that Lu Jinglong was actually a sanctimonious pervert when she returned home, claiming that he liked to steal glances at people's chests and bum as long as they were female. Not only that, but he was also as basic as could be, being especially fond of those seductive women who cake their faces with makeup. Guemo would anger to death those Taoist nuns who didn't dare to leave home after secretly putting on some makeup. In some sense, she was helping them cultivate in peace, no? Taking 10,000 steps back, she was helping them save some money by not needing to buy makeup, no? And thus, Guemo went from not being able to stand this young sword immortal from the Great Emblem Sword sect to becoming fonder and fonder of him. Two Taoist priests, one old and one young, walked along the bank of a large lake in the Middle-earth divine continent. The autumn wind rustled the trees and plants, and the old Taoist priest said to his disciple that he was going to visit an old friend. The young disciple didn't ask about who it was, nor did he ask about the cultivation base of this old friend. There was no need to ask these questions. Back then, they had been turned back by a scholar at that solitary island in the sea. Afterward, the young Taoist priest had sighed with emotion regarding his master's cultivation, especially after his master revealed that the scholar wasn't a terrestrial immortal, nor was he at the unpolished jade tier, the immortal tier, or the ascension tier. The young Taoist priest had initially wanted to console his master, but upon seeing his master's indifferent demeanor, he had ultimately decided against saying anything. This was also good. His master was poor at slaying demons and vanquishing fiends, while his Tao power was also a pathetic mess. This was seemingly a very good match. His master had brought him to the Middle-earth divine continent afterward, visiting their upper sect, Mount Longhu. However, Zhang Shanfeng's master had left him at the foot of the mountain, causing him to feel slightly disappointed. He felt like his master wasn't high-ranking and influential enough, leaving him unable to bring an extra person into the mountain. As such, Zhang Shanfeng hadn't said anything about this. His master had simply said that he wanted to ask those esteemed Taoist priests for a favor. If he succeeded, then Zhang Shanfeng could enter the mountain as well. Hearing this, Zhang Shanfeng had asked his master to put in some more effort and be more friendly with those esteemed Taoist priests, and not to be as indifferent as he was back home. After all, it was completely up to his master's performance whether he could visit the Heavenly Master residence or not. Zhang Shanfeng's master had replied that there was nothing to worry about, and that he could trust his master. A look of grief had appeared in Zhang Shanfeng's eyes. He had cultivated at Ground Lying Peak for so many years, yet what had his master achieved there? Taoist priests from the other branches would occasionally visit to discuss matters with his master, yet he would either be sound asleep or he would ask Zhang Shanfeng or his elderly senior brothers to help him avoid the meetings. As time went on, the Taoist priests from the Profound Dawn branch, the White Cloud branch, and the Secret Profound branch would immediately sigh when they came to discuss matters but were greeted by Zhang Shanfeng. They would turn around and leave without any hesitation. Even though it was completely reasonable for disciples to help alleviate troubles for their masters, it was taking things too far to have them face the troubles head-on every single time by themselves, no? The old Taoist priest had descended the mountain soon after ascending, saying that he had no luck in his discussions with the esteemed Taoist priests. His disciple would most likely have no opportunity to visit the Heavenly Master residence to broaden his horizons. Zhang Shanfeng had replied that this was okay, and he even said a few words to console his master. The old Taoist priest was extremely grateful, and he had remarked with emotion that his disciple was truly caring and considerate toward his master. Zhang Shanfeng had gazed up at the distant Mount Longhu, feeling slightly disappointed as he looked at the wisps of immortal energy, the flocks of soaring cranes, and the shimmering treasured light. However, he hadn't felt disappointed in his master, and he had instead been disappointed in himself. He had heeded his master's instructions and left Ground Lying Peak back then, traveling far away to experience the scenery of the distant lands. Zhang Shanfeng had taken an intercontinental ship and directly visited another continent, yet he had ended up feeling despondent after traveling around for a while. Unwilling to return home like this, he had gritted his teeth and spent almost all of his immortal coins to take Ceremony Mountain's intercontinental ship to the eastern treasured Vile continent. He had made a new friend, and sometime afterward he had made another friend. The three of them had eventually parted ways before reuniting and parting ways again. The young Taoist priest had gained a better understanding of many things following his trip around the outside world. Thus Zhang Shanfeng felt increasing gratitude toward his master. The old Taoist priest stopped at some place on the bank of the large lake, saying that they would wait here for a while. Zhang Shanfeng stood beside his master with a bamboo bookcase on his back, and he asked in a quiet voice, "Master, you didn't bring any presents for this visit?" The old Taoist priest, who had 2 fire dragons embroidered on the sleeves of his Taoist robe, frowned in worry and replied, "I was in a rush to get here, so I completely forgot about that." Zhang Shanfeng sighed and said, "Even if the present only costs a few snowflake coins, a small gift can still be a token of profound friendship. Master, are we being too casual about this? How about you tell me in advance before you visit a friend next time? That way, I can help Master prepare the presents." The old Taoist priest thought about this for a moment before nodding and accepting Zhang Shanfeng's proposal, resisting the urge to tell his disciple the truth. If they visited with gifts, the water god of this large lake would mistakenly think that they were showing respect before using force. He would most likely feel weak at the knees, convinced that he was going to be skinned and have his tendons cut. Even though he was the #1 water god in the 3rd largest empire in the majestic world, he had truly been lacking as a person. As a god back then, Zhang Shanfeng's master had also been someone with a bad temper, so he had directly channeled a mystical ability to boil the large lake. When the water level of the large lake fell by 3 meters, the powerful water god had finally fallen to his knees and kowtowed, begging Zhang Shanfeng's master to show mercy. The old spiritual master, who was using an illusion technique, released a wisp of his aura. An old man wearing a golden robe quickly rose from the water, remaining silent as he walked ashore. He didn't dare to speak, and a million warning bells were ringing loudly in his mind. He stood there in fear and trepidation, and his expression was as tense as could be. He was afraid that he would give in to the urge to fall to his knees and tearfully talk about how pitiful he was, uttering some cringeworthy praise for the old Taoist priest at the same time. But what if he accidentally caused the old immortal to feel displeased instead? Wouldn't that be an absolute disaster? He was a water god with a relatively lofty status and cultivation base in this mortal empire and in the surrounding regions, and he was also renowned as a very difficult and unyielding individual. Indeed, he had engaged in many intense battles with powerful cultivators from other continents in the past. However, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was a very clear exception. Generally speaking, the powerful immortals could only rely on their immortal techniques and immortal treasures to fracture his godly body and give him severe wounds. However, he could recover from these wounds and repair his godly body relying on the incense offerings as well as the water fortune. However, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was powerful enough to pulverize him and give him absolutely no chance to fight back. As for why Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was able to casually target a water god, yet the Confucian academies in the Middle-earth Divine Continent almost didn't restrict him with any of their rules and regulations, there was naturally something quite strange about this. Zhang Shanfeng glanced at the water god, who looked like a lofty immortal cultivating in seclusion here, and looking at his cold and unspeaking expression, he couldn't help but grumble in his mind about his master. Just look at this. Did this look like a happy reunion between old friends? Perhaps his master had felt embarrassed about being rejected at Mount Longhu, so he wanted to come to Mirage Lake and look for some random friend to show off in front of his disciple, bragging about his extensive network of friends in the Middle-earth Divine Continent? In reality, there was genuinely no need for his master to do this. In fact, Zhang Shanfeng was starting to feel a bit sorry for his master. Zhang Shanfeng coughed and said, "Master." The adrift Spiritual Master Fire Dragon came to his senses and smiled faintly, saying, "It's been a long time." The old man wearing a golden robe gulped and forced a smile, replying, "Yes, it's been a long time." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon couldn't be bothered speaking any nonsense with the water god of Mirage Lake, so he directly said, "I'm here to ask for a bottle of water elixir." The old man wearing golden robes almost shed tears on the spot. It was only a single bottle of bonded water elixir from Mirage Lake's Water God Palace, so just a simple message from Spiritual Master Fire Dragon would have been enough to get this minor matter done. As such, was there any need for the Spiritual Master to personally travel here? Wouldn't traveling these few extra steps be a waste of the old immortal's time? Didn't Spiritual Master Fire Dragon know that his appearance had almost scared the water god to death? The old man in golden robes felt like he had just survived a brush with death, so he decided that he would hold a banquet at the Water God Palace when he returned in a moment. He had felt worried and apprehensive for the past 1,000 years, after all fearful that he would be severely punished if not killed the next time he came across Spiritual Master Fire Dragon. To his surprise, however, a single bottle of water elixir was the only thing required to resolve the situation. Of course, this was a small price to pay only in the context of the other person being Spiritual Master Fire Dragon, an old immortal at the peak stage of the Ascension tier. If it were any other Ascension tier cultivator who was skilled at fire element mystical techniques, they wouldn't dare to come here and ask for a bottle of water elixir from Mirage Lake. He was an extremely high-ranking water god in the Middle Earth Divine Continent, so he could at least flee even if he couldn't defeat his opponent. After he returned to the water, what could his opponent possibly do? In any case, even if his opponents relied on their superior strength to bully him and cause a huge commotion, the Empire and the Confucian Academies definitely wouldn't stand by and do nothing. And thus, the old man wearing a golden robe immediately retrieved a bottle of water elixir, asking carefully, "Is one bottle enough?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and asked, "What do you think?" The old man wearing golden robes didn't say anything, and he was just about to retrieve another bottle of water elixir that contained the condensed water fortune essence of Mirage Lake. In reality, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon genuinely only needed a single bottle, but he suddenly remembered that some of the disciples and grand disciples from his sect's White Clouds branch might need this water elixir to help them break through to the next cultivation tier. As such, he didn't plan to turn down any extra bottles of water elixir that he was offered. Feng lightly tugged his master's sleeve. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "Your friend gave you such a huge present, and he's also treated you in such a sincere manner. Even though your master gave him some small benefits afterward according to the seniority of your master, what we gave him was truly not enough. So, I plan to give him a bottle of water elixir as well, both helping you return the favor and also severing some strands of karmic fate. As for the other bottle, it's for one of your senior brothers from the White Cloud branch." Feng didn't really understand what his master meant by small benefits and karmic fate. However, it was ultimately a brilliant outcome for Qian Ping'an to receive a bottle of water elixir. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't mind his disciple walking the path of the Great Tao together with Qian Ping'an, but there were still some minor matters pertaining to karmic fate that he needed to clean up. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon accepted the 2 bottles of water elixir. At the same time, he silently left a fire flood dragon that was as thin as a thread on the palm of Mirage Lake's water god, helping him temper his godly body. It was important to reciprocate when receiving benefits from other people. Moreover, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon hadn't been willing to prematurely accelerate Qian Ping'an's growth back then, so in reality, his disciple, or more accurately, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon himself, owed Qian Ping'an 2 favors. One was for the seal personally engraved by the previous Heavenly Master. This seal wasn't very valuable, but it held great significance for Feng. This was a karmic Tao opportunity. To Taoist priests, karmic Tao opportunities were the biggest opportunities in the world. They were even more important than immortal treasures and celestial tools. The second was for the sword, and this counted as another karmic Tao opportunity. This was also an important reason why Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had been willing to not get angry at the Heavenly Master residence after having his request turned down this time. After ascending the mountain as per their agreement this time, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had hoped that his disciple Feng could be acknowledged by the great Heavenly Master of the Heavenly Master residence, allowing him to become a hereditary external Heavenly Master. Even though the Heavenly Master residents agreed that Feng could achieve great heights on the path of the Great Tao in the future, it also felt like signs of a hugely chaotic time had already arrived. Because of this, a mighty figure of the future would be unable to solve the troubles of today, especially since they were sure that Feng couldn't become a critical pillar of Mount Longhu within 100 years. In addition, the Heavenly Master residence had also recruited 2 external Heavenly Masters in waiting during the past 1,000 years, so it didn't accept Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's proposal. In other words, once Spiritual Master Fire Dragon genuinely ascended from the northern complete Reed continent, the Heavenly Master residence in the Middle Earth Divine Continent would promote a new external Heavenly Master. Even though they would be far inferior to Spiritual Master Fire Dragon, they would still be far better than Zhongshan Feng. Apart from the calm and composed Great Heavenly Master, almost all of the esteemed Taoist priests in the ancestral hall of the Heavenly Master residence had felt uneasy and apprehensive at the time. They were afraid of Spiritual Master Fire Dragon lashing out in anger. Thankfully, the old Spiritual Master had silently descended the mountain and left Mount Longhu with his disciple, Sage Ruanqiong, who had already disappeared for a long time, finally decided to return home. He went to the shop on the bank of the Dragon Whisker River to visit his disciple, Su Xiaoqiao, first, after which he casually tossed 2 spirits out of his jurisdiction. These were spirits that had subordinated themselves to immortal forces located in the mountains to the west, yet failed to abide by the rules of this region. After doing this, Ruanqiong returned home to the Dragon Spring Sword sect located in Divine Elegance Mountain. Second senior brother Donggu gathered the 12 disciples who had been recruited after himself and Su Xiaoqiao, telling them to display their sword skills one by one. Ruanqiong remained expressionless the entire time, not guiding his unofficial disciples or providing them with any feedback regarding their sword techniques. After watching their displays, he stood up from the bench and left to forge iron and craft swords. This caused the initially confident unofficial disciples to feel nervous and uneasy. Their senior sister, who liked to wear green garb, didn't appear at all. Fourth senior brother Xieling was present, yet he sighed at the end and returned to his residence to continue cultivating. Following Ruanqiong's return, a continuous stream of people started to visit the Dragon Spring Sword sect, hoping to catch the attention of this sect-level immortal force and become its disciple. There were youths accompanied by members of their powerful and noble clans, there were young boys and young girls who had come by themselves, and there were also many vagrant cultivators who hoped to become guest elders of immortal forces in the mountains. There were people from all walks of life. This caused Donggu, Ruanqiong's first disciple in name, to feel very annoyed. Not only did Donggu need to act as somewhat of a temporary master for his 12 unofficial junior brothers and junior sisters, who were yet to have their names recorded in the genealogical records of the ancestral hall, but he even needed to attend to all of the matters in the sect, no matter large or small. Moreover, the 12 unofficial disciples had already cultivated at the Dragon Spring Sword sect for a decent amount of time, so they were now roughly aware of each other's talent and cultivation aptitude. This caused their characters and personalities to slowly become clear. There were some who believed their talent in sword cultivation was inferior to the others, so they focused their attention on building networks and relationships with other people instead. There's some who cultivated sword techniques in earnest yet progressed slowly and failed to see any results. There were some who showed respect and modesty in the mountains yet liked to show off their statuses as disciples of the sword sect outside the mountains, and there were also innate sword talents who were far superior to others their age and progressed in leaps and bounds, already reaching a stage where they privately asked Donggu to teach them an additional high-level sword technique of the Wind Snow Temple. As for the immortal forces that had constructed residences in the mountains to the west, many of them visited Divine Elegance Mountain, so Donggu naturally needed to entertain these guests as well. This was a very time-consuming and mentally taxing task. Senior sister Ruanqiao definitely wouldn't deal with these matters, while junior sister Su Xiaoqiao was a cold and aloof person who innately disliked hosting guests. Xieling was even less willing to smile in a perfunctory manner to entertain guests. If it weren't for the Dragon Spring Sword sect not needing to focus time and effort on making money, Donggu almost wanted to go back on his word and actively ask Master Ruanqiong to open a new peak for him, allowing him to justifiably cultivate in seclusion. Donggu had set a goal for himself, aiming to advance to the nascent tier within 100 years. After all, Donggu was different from Su Xiaoqiao, who had already been a sword cultivator of the Wind Snow Temple before joining the Dragon Spring Sword sect. Even though Donggu was the opening disciple of the Dragon Spring Sword sect according to the genealogical records in the Ancestral Hall, he wasn't actually a sword cultivator, something that was very much in contradiction with the rules and regulations. Ruanqiong didn't care about this, but Donggu felt extremely guilty and ashamed. As a result, Donggu came up with a very crude solution, deciding to make up for things with his cultivation base since he wasn't a sword cultivator. As for junior brother Xieling, he had already birthed a bonded flying sword, which he was nurturing right now. Not only that, but the old ancestor of the Xie clan, the northern complete reed continent's heavenly lord Xiesher, who had displayed his might and suppressed an entire continent by himself, had gifted his descendant from Peach Leaf Alley two extremely valuable treasures from the mountains. One was a relic left behind by a sword immortal, and heavenly lord Xiesher had told Xieling to refine this treasure, named Peach Leaf, into a bonded item. In fact, this treasure was a bonded flying sword left behind following the sword immortal's passing. Even though it couldn't be regarded as Xieling's flying sword, one could imagine the might of a bonded flying sword left behind by a sword immortal after it was refined into Xieling's bonded item. There was also an extremely high-grade sword nurturing gourd named Full Moon. Donggu was well aware that junior brother Xieling didn't hold him in high regard. This wasn't to say that Xieling was arrogant and haughty because of his family background, and it was, in fact, the complete opposite. Xieling didn't show any disrespect toward Donggu, nor did he express any disdain toward Donggu's identity and background. Xieling never refused to help, and during critical stages of Donggu's cultivation following his advance to the Golden Core tier, Xieling would voluntarily teach his junior sword techniques in Donggu's stead. Long eyebrows. Xieling was flawless in his conduct. However, Xieling's aptitude and fated opportunities were far too good, so much so that he only held Ruanqiu in high regard when it came to those in the mountains. As for those outside the mountains, he only had his eyes on Ma Kuxuan and a very small number of young cultivators. After reaching Donggu and Xieling's cultivation bases, they naturally didn't need to rely on ingesting ordinary food to survive. Rather, they adhered to the recipes meticulously put together by the 100 Schools of Thought School of Medicine to prepare their 3 daily meals. This was a habit that required a huge amount of immortal coins. However, the Dragon Spring Sword sect was influential and wealthy, but only had very few disciples. At the same time, Ruanqiong was also the #1 guest elder of the Great Li Empire, allowing him to collect a large amount of compensation from the imperial court each year. As for Donggu, he was a Golden Core tier cultivator who had traveled to Bamboo Scroll Lake before, yet he hadn't needed to do much at the time. Even so, he had received a good amount of compensation for his effort, eventually receiving a peace and safety tablet issued by the Ministry of Justice afterward. And now, he was also listed as a sticky rod official of the Great Li Empire, allowing him to also receive a healthy amount of compensation from the imperial court. On this day, Ruanqiong left the blacksmith forge and personally cooked a few dishes, inviting only Donggu over. Looking at the mortal dishes on the table, Donggu knew that senior sister Ruanqiu would definitely come as well. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Ruanqiu entered the room and scooped herself a bowl of rice, sitting down beside Ruanqiong. Donggu naturally sat opposite Ruanqiong, with his back facing the entrance. Eat slowly. No one will fight for food with you. Ruanqiong naturally grabbed a piece of braised pork belly and placed it in his daughter's bowl, after which he asked Donggu, "I heard that prefectural overseer Wu Yuan has been transferred away from our new province?" Donggu immediately put down his chopsticks and replied in a respectful voice, "After the Dragon Spring Prefecture was promoted to Dragon Province, this disciple of the Imperial Preceptor didn't receive an accompanying promotion and become the governor of Dragon Province. Rather, he was transferred to an area south of Lakeview Academy, which was previously the territory of the luminous Vermilion Empire. He's continuing to serve as a prefectural overseer near the foot of the Great Li Empire's newly chosen central mountain." Everyone guessed that the Imperial Preceptor had initially held high hopes for Wu Yuan, and it was because of this that he had been appointed as the county magistrate of the Dragon Spring County, and been tasked with expanding and developing this region. Unexpectedly, however, he was severely marginalized by the 4 families and 10 clans in the small town, facing many small troubles along the way. Even though Wu Yuan was promoted to the position of prefectural overseer afterward, the Imperial Preceptor was already dissatisfied with his performance. Thus, Wu Yuan, who should at least be commended for his hard work even if he weren't commended for his merit, was transferred to a region previously belonging to another empire. This looked like a straight transfer, yet it was actually a demotion. After the Dragon Spring Prefecture was promoted to Dragon Province, its territory was expanded to now include the Azure Porcelain Prefecture, Treasure Stream Prefecture, Three River Prefecture, and Incense Fire Prefecture. The small town was still a part of Locust Yellow County. County Magistrate Yuan was promoted to the position of Prefectural Overseer of the Azure Porcelain Prefecture, while Kiln Supervision Official Chao remained in his original position. However, the Ministry of Rites quietly adjusted the official rank of the Kiln Supervision Official, promoting it to a rank that was equivalent to Prefectural Overseers. Because of this change, both the young talents of the two pillar clans had essentially been promoted to higher ranks. It was just that one was promoted openly while the other was promoted subtly. The governor of Dragon Province had come from outside the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. He was called Wei Li, and he had come from a humble upbringing in the Yellow Court Nation, a vassal state of the Great Li Empire. He had only been a prefectural overseer, a measly fourth-rank official in the Yellow Court Nation, yet he had immediately become a lofty provincial governor after arriving at the Great Li Empire, causing those in the imperial court to feel very surprised. Rumors started to circulate around the capital, claiming that there were no complaints because this person had been handpicked by the Ministry of Personnel's head minister. An exception had been made to promote an official of a vassal state to a high-ranking official of the Great Li Empire. So was this an action that went against etiquette? However, the emperor hadn't said anything, nor had the Ministry of Rites kicked up a fuss. That being the case, who dared to jump forward and complain? Was anyone foolish enough to treat head minister Guan as a pushover? After all, he was one of very few officials who had once managed to defeat imperial preceptor Cui in a debate. Apart from the changes in the imperial court, the city gods of the province, prefecture, and county were also confirmed. The city gods of the prefectural city and the county city were both heroic spirits who had been recommended by two large neighboring provinces. Even though they had already existed in the official records of the Great Li Empire's Ministry of Rites as candidates for positions of city gods of mountain and water deities, they definitely wouldn't have received overly good positions under normal circumstances. Now, however, they were mysteriously appointed as city gods of regions inside Dragon Province, something that caused a lot of envy. The first city god of Dragon Province enjoyed the highest deity rank, and after his identity was revealed, a fairly large commotion had taken place in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. Many high-ranking officials were laughing at the Pillar Yuan clan and the Pillar Chao clan. This was because the provincial city god wasn't either of the candidates recommended by the two pillar clans. Rather, they were a small mountain lord of Steamed Bun Mountain, a place located at the intersection of the Embroidered Flower River and the rushing Tranquil River. Wu Yuan leaving the original territory of the Great Li Empire isn't necessarily a bad thing, Ruanqiong said slowly. Donggu wasn't very familiar with the internal affairs of the Great Li Empire's imperial court, so he didn't dare to make any comment regarding this matter. However, Donggu felt slightly disappointed about Wu Yuan's departure, because this young prefectural overseer was extremely good with people. Donggu greatly appreciated Wu Yuan's method of interacting with the Dragon Spring Sword sect. Fortunately, the newly appointed prefectural overseer of the Treasure Stream Prefecture was Fu Yu, an official who had previously accompanied Wu Yuan to the county office of the small town. Fu Yu had started off as a scholarly secretary, and only after he left the shadows and came to the fore did many of his colleagues, who had already worked with him for numerous years, discover with astonishment that prefectural overseer Fu was actually a direct descendant of the Great Li Empire's powerful Fu clan. Indeed, the Fu clan was one of the most powerful and influential clans outside the pillar clans. Fu Yu had visited the Dragon Spring Sword sect very soon after being promoted to the prefectural overseer of the Treasure Stream Prefecture, and Donggu had enjoyed a friendly conversation with him. This was a fairly good outcome. You don't need to deal with the guests who visit our mountains in the future, Ruanqiong said. You'll be stuck with these matters forever if you don't extract yourself from them. So how will you still have time to cultivate if that's the case? The founding tenet of the Dragon Spring Sword sect isn't about building interpersonal relationships. Ruanqiong glanced at Donggu, with the latter feeling slightly fearful at this moment. He was most likely misunderstanding his master's words and thinking that his master was dissatisfied with him. A rare smile appeared on Ruanqiong's face as he continued. I didn't take you as my disciple to have you manage these mundane and trivial affairs. Cultivation is separated into cultivation in the mountains and cultivation outside the mountains. You can be regarded as half a sticky rod official now, so each time you come across a small barrier in the mountains, there's no need to waste your time here, and you can take the opportunity to train in the outside world instead. You can also take initiative and communicate with the Great Li Empire's Ministry of Justice through ordinary letters. Things are chaotic in the Eastern Treasured Vile continent right now, so you might even be able to recruit a few disciples and bring them back while you're training in the outside world. Next time you travel outside the mountains, you can notify the Ministry of Justice beforehand and visit the region surrounding Ganzhou Mountain first. After all, it's still important for you to build a good relationship with the Wind Snow Temple. Donggu nodded in understanding, feeling a huge sense of relief as he did so. He was filled with gratitude toward his master. Ruanxiong had only spoken a few words, but he had both taken some pressure off his disciple and also given him valuable guidance. More importantly, he had indirectly allowed Guemo to receive acknowledgement and approval from the Wind Snow Temple's cultivators. Ruanxiong suddenly raised his chopsticks and swatted away his daughter's chopsticks, which were reaching toward the last piece of braised pork belly. "Leave some for Donggu," he said. Ruanxiong had already refilled her rice bowl a good number of times. Donggu didn't dare to laugh. "What do you think about the 12 unofficial disciples?" Ruanxiong asked. Donggu described the talents and characters of his 12 junior brothers and junior sisters, both good and bad. Ruanxiong looked at his daughter. Ruanxiong had just grabbed a chopstick full of food, and she lightly shook it after seeing her father's gaze, getting slightly less food. Ruanxiong glanced at the almost empty dish and decided to directly push it to his daughter. Ruanxiong smiled and asked, "You're not going to drink wine today, Dad?" Ruanxiong shook his head and suddenly said, "When you cultivate in seclusion at Dragon's Pine Mountain, remember not to clash with the cultivators of True Martial Mountain. Also, there's no need to be surprised no matter what strange matters you come across. Your dad is aware of the situation." Ruanxiong nodded in response. Ruanxiong asked about the current situation in the Great Li Empire. In fact, the Dragon Spring Prefecture received the most detailed newspaper in the Eastern Treasured Vile continent, one that was personally compiled and edited by the Imperial Court of the Great Li Empire. These newspapers were delivered to Cloud Drape Mountain and Divine Elegance Mountain at set periods. Truth be told, the person I most wanted to take as a disciple back then was actually Lu Xianyang, Ruanxiong said out of the blue. Donggu had heard of this person before. He was best friends with Clay Vase Alice Chan Ping'an. Afterward, he had almost died at the hands of Sun Scorch Mountain's mountain-moving ape. Because of this, Lu Xianyang and Chan Ping'an bore a strong grudge against Sun Scorch Mountain and Light Breeze City's Su clan. The Su clan had sold their completed immortal residence to the Imperial Court of the Great Li Empire for a very low price, and part of the reason had been their apprehension of Chan Ping'an. Afterward, Light Breeze City's Su clan had acted according to the Great Trend, wedding a direct descendant to an illegitimate son of the Pillar Yuan clan. Not only that, but they even provided money and manpower as well, helping the descendant of the Yuan clan gain command over a unit of heavy cavalry at the border region. After all, no one had imagined that an orphan little boy from an impoverished alley in the small town could walk step by step to where he was today. Ruanxiong and Donggu symbolically ate a few mouthfuls of food. The master and disciple then started to stroll around Chan Ping and pulled his feet from the stream and exhaled. He then shook his right hand, surprisingly causing some ashes to fall to the ground. His right arm had been bound by a Buddhist mystical ability unleashed by the assassin from Deer Cutter Mountain before, and the falling ashes at this moment were a sign of the lingering karmic ties being completely shaken away. As a sword cultivator who was imminently about to advance to the nascent tier, Qi Jinglong's remark about the assassination attempt in the mountain valley had been this: incredibly dangerous. A large part of this was because of the Buddhist mystical ability. Chan Ping'an squatted down and scooped up some water to wash his face. He cocked his head and looked at his reflection in the water, rubbing the thick stubble on his chin. He was slightly worried that he would become a big bearded man like Su Yuanxia. Chan Ping'an placed his hand in the water and opened his palm, gently pushing down and causing the flowing stream to suddenly stop. However, everything returned to normal after a brief moment. Chan Ping'an changed his hand gesture, drawing a circle in the water and causing a water vortex to continually grow in size. However, Qian Pingyan quickly stopped and allowed the stream water to return to a calm state. When traveling around with Zhang Shanfeng before, Qian Pingyan had often seen the young Taoist priest gesturing by himself, with his fist techniques not looking like fist techniques and his palm techniques not looking like palm techniques. Zhang Shanfeng's intent was very strange, so Qian Pingyan had decided to roughly learn some of the stances. However, he always felt like something was off. This was quite strange. When talking about the strength of fist techniques, even 100 Zhang Shanfengs couldn't rival a single Qian Pingyan, especially since Qian Pingyan was very talented and quick when it came to learning fist techniques. For example, Zhong Qiu had used his fundamental examining the dragon technique in the lotus flower blessed land, and Qian Pingyan had immediately emulated the fist technique after observing it once, not only managing to emulate its form, but even managing to somewhat emulate its intent. However, Qian Pingyan was unable to emulate Zhang Shanfeng's fist technique no matter what. Qian Pingyan didn't think too deeply about this matter as he squatted in front of the stream, simply treating Zhang Shanfeng's fist technique as a unique qi nurturing method used by cultivators in the mountains, something that required an accompanying Dao mantra. Why were martial artists at the lowest echelon of the cultivation world derided as bottom-feeding ruffians? This was because their fist stances and techniques failed to capture any true intent. At the end of the day, what was truly important was still that breath of true qi and its route through the body. Delving deeper, what was important was the mind's intent, another extremely mystical state. The same type of fist stance could accommodate a large number of varying fist intents, so the same master teaching the same fist guide could result in their disciples displaying all kinds of different fist intents. This was similar to people having different feelings and comprehensions when observing the same mountains and waters in the world. Indeed, this was the basis behind the saying. The master is only responsible for teaching the basics, while the disciples' talent and hard work will decide how far they can go. Qian Pingyan stood up, performing the six-step walking meditation once to slowly stretch his body. Refining a hero's goal was the key to advancing to the sixth tier. A so-called hero's goal wasn't a physical matter, and it was instead the location where a martial artist's soul and breath of true qi were nurtured. Its significance was slightly similar to the golden core of qi refiners. Qian Pingyan had previously said that he was only 2 steps short of breaking through to the next martial arts tier. Now that he had refined a hero's goal, he was only a single step short. In reality, the toughness of Qian Pingyan's physique had long reached a level that could rival that of Vajrabhati tier martial artists. The punishment from Cui Cheng's fists, the sparring matches against Zhu Lian, the tempering in the thunderclouds of the heavenly tribulation, and the many battles during his extensive travels. Of course, there was also his diligent and unwavering training of the fist techniques. All of these experiences could be regarded as the external cultivation of a pure martial artist. However, this was extremely likely to become a big barrier for Qian Pingyan, creating a huge gulf to the Vajrabhati tier. Qian Pingyan was in no rush. The bigger the barrier was, the better. After all, this would give him a better chance of fighting to become the strongest 6th-tier martial artist. Qian Pingyan had almost never thought about the notion of strongest before, and when he had become the strongest 3rd-tier martial artist in the past, that had simply been a side effect of his physique being brutally tempered by the old man in Downtrodden Mountains bamboo building. It had absolutely nothing to do with Qian Pingyan's own desires. After landing in the clutches of Cui Cheng, a 10th-tier martial artist, did Qian Pingyan still have the luxury of deciding whether he wanted something or not? Of the fundamental threads of thought in Qian Pingyan's mind, the origin of one strand was Old Man Yao's remark: if something is meant to be yours, then hold on to it and don't let it go. If something's not meant to be yours, then don't even think about it. To summarize this remark even further, it was essentially the same as the 4 characters written on the Buddhist plaque decorating the crab archway: refrain from looking outward. This naturally extended further to the saying, if it's not meant to be, then there's no point in forcing things. This was a principle that Qian Pingyan viewed as completely natural and justified, which was a reflection of his maturing thread of thought. Thus, Qian Pingyan's speech and actions were all subconsciously affected by these beliefs. For example, Qian Pingyan had pushed away the martial fortune when cultivating at Old Dragon City, and 2 times in a row at that. Chen Ping'an was also almost never willing to voluntarily enter blessed lands to seek fated opportunities, instead preferring to pick up trash to accumulate minor wealth. This was similar to people gazing at streams, often only seeing the gurgling water and seldom ever seeing the bottom of the stream. Chen Ping'an was no exception in the past, and this was something that he had only slowly understood following his journey through the northern complete reed continent, where he continued to observe people, observe Tao, cultivate, and question his own conscience. To understand others was wise, and to understand oneself was enlightened. This was very difficult. Thus, it needed to be ruminated on and polished again and again, with the resulting essence truly becoming one's own principle. Chen Ping'an once again sat down beside the stream. He glanced toward the south. It was unknown what he was thinking about. He started to chuckle to himself. He then raised a hand and feigned a knuckle to someone's forehead. How is Pei Qian currently faring in the private school? Die. An intercontinental ship from Skeleton Shoal's Flax Robe sect slowly docked at Dragon Spring Prefecture's Oxhorn Mountain. There was a slender and shapely woman wearing a veiled hat and holding a hiking pole standing on the intercontinental ship, and standing beside her was a Tao guardian who radiated with the aura of a golden core tier cultivator. They were none other than Sui Jingcheng and Duckweed Sword Lake Sword cultivator Rong Chong, who had traveled south from the northern complete reed continent. After the intercontinental ship had entered the territory of the eastern treasured vial continent, Sui Jingcheng had frequently left her room and stood at the bow of the ship to peer down at the mountains and rivers of this continent. Beneath them was the Great Li Empire. When the intercontinental ship had entered Dragon Province, where the Jewel Small World had been demoted to a blessed land, Rong Chong had glanced at the distant cloud-draped mountain and remarked with emotion, "Such an astonishing aura. As expected of the northern mountain of a continent." There were many sets of 5 mountains in the northern complete reed continent as well, but they were all far inferior to Cloud-Draped Mountain, which had suddenly risen to prominence in a very short amount of time. Upon hearing that mountain god Wei Bo of the northern mountain was on the verge of advancing to the upper 5 tiers, Rong Chong further sighed with emotion. Mountain gods guarding their territories were similar to sages overseeing small worlds. They needed to be regarded as one cultivation base higher. Once Wei Bo advanced to the unpolished Jade tier, the Great Li Empire would have essentially gained an immortal tier deity. His combat power wasn't actually important, and the most important aspect was the fortune of the Great Li Empire. Casting one's gaze over the territory of the northern mountain, the spiritual energy of the mountains and rivers, as well as the scholarly fortune and martial fortune of the region, would become increasingly stable because of this. According to Sui Jingcheng's words, the senior sword immortal had an extremely close relationship with mountain god Wei Bo. It was late at night, and there were only a small number of immortal ships at Oxhorn Mountain's ferry station. As such, the Flax Robe sect's intercontinental ship appeared especially eye-catching in comparison. The intercontinental ship would stop here for one day and set off again tomorrow night, allowing the passengers from the northern complete reed continent to disembark and look around this former small world, which had shattered and plummeted to the ground. It was said that an immortal shop had just opened at Oxhorn Mountain, but it was up to the customers' wealth and judgment to determine whether or not they could find a bargain. At the same time, the steward of the Flax Robe sect's intercontinental ship clearly notified the passengers that this was the territory of the eastern treasured vial continent's northern mountain. This was no longer the northern complete reed continent. Moreover, the Dragon Spring Prefecture was also overseen by Sage Ruan Qiong, who hailed from the Wind Snow Temple, with the rules and regulations in this region being incredibly strict. Cultivators weren't allowed to wantonly fly on the wind or on their swords. With this in mind, the passengers shouldn't blame the Flax Robe sect for standing idly by if they were to leave the intercontinental ship and cause trouble. A man in white, who possessed a godly demeanor, appeared at the ferry station. A golden earring hung from one of his ears, and he smiled as he looked at Sui Jingcheng and Rong Chong. Sparrows surrounded by spiritual energy fluttered around him, with an iridescent glow vaguely flowing around his body. Rong Chong couldn't see through this man's cultivation base, and this made it very clear who he was. He was none other than Wei Bo, the highest-ranking mountain god in the entire eastern treasured vial continent. Sui Jingcheng hurriedly walked forward and asked in a soft voice, "Are you mountain god Wei?" Wei Bo glanced at the hiking pole in Sui Jingcheng's hand before raising a hand and gently shooing away the sparrows fluttering around him. He then nodded in response and replied with a faint smile, I already received the messenger flying sword, so I came here to welcome the two of you. Rongchang was slightly astonished. Since when had there been such warm and polite mountain gods? And he had especially come here to welcome the two of them? At the end of the day, Sui Jingcheng and Rongchang were nothing more than outsiders from a distant continent. In other regions of the eastern treasured Vile continent, perhaps it wouldn't have been strange for a nascent tier sword cultivator like Rongchang to receive such treatment. However, Rongchang didn't believe he had a lofty enough status to receive such treatment at the Greatly Empire's cloud-draped mountain. Disregarding everything else, this region, which was previously the Jewel's small world, contained a large number of powerful and hidden immortals. There was the northern complete reed continent's heavenly lord Xieshur, and also the southern world continent's sword immortal Chao Shi. They were only two examples, and it was said that both of them had come from the small town in the Jewel's small world. Thus, when visiting this region, one shouldn't try to use their cultivation base to suppress others and get their way. Doing so would be laughable. Sui Jingcheng felt slightly fearful as she curtsied and said, Thank you for coming here to welcome us, Mountain God Wei. Weibo waved his hand and said with a friendly smile, There's no need to be so polite, Miss Sui. Do you want to visit Oxhorn Mountain's cloth wrapper shop? Or do you want to directly head over to Downtrodden Mountain? We'll go to Downtrodden Mountain first, Sui Jingcheng replied. Weibo nodded and channeled his mystical power, bringing Sui Jingcheng and Rongchang to the foot of Downtrodden Mountain. Rongchang once again felt astonished. It presumably wouldn't be a big challenge for this formal god of the Greatly Empire's northern mountain to advance to the upper 5 tiers, seeing that his affinity with the mountains and waters was so shockingly high. Rongchang was taken on a distant trip via a land-shortening technique, yet he discovered that his bonded flying sword barely reacted at all. This is Chan Pingan's mountain, so it won't be appropriate for me to directly bring the two of you to the residence at the waist of the mountain. I'll have to trouble Miss Sui and Sword Immortal Rong with climbing up the mountain by yourselves, Weibo said in an apologetic voice. There was a residence near the mountain entrance, and a hunchbacked man didn't even put on his shoes, running over barefoot and keeping his eyes fixed on the young woman wearing a veiled hat. He didn't spare so much as a single glance for the man. This is Brother Dafeng, the gatekeeper of Downtrodden Mountain, Weibo said in introduction. Zhang Dafeng stood beside Weibo, rubbing his hands together as he said with a smile, You're Miss Sui, correct? Do you want to visit my place first? Weibo and I can make some midnight snacks, and you can treat this as us helping Chan Ping and warmly welcome his guest. After Miss Sui eats and drinks her fill, she can feel free to rest at my place if she so desires. My residence is big and has many rooms, so to say nothing of Miss Sui alone, there's enough space even if you want to bring a few friends along. Oh, that's right. My surname is Zheng, so Miss Sui can refer to me as Big Brother Zheng. There's no need to be too formal. Sui Jingcheng was slightly flustered. Miss Sui and Sword Immortal Rong, you can either rest here and eat some midnight snacks, or you can choose to immediately climb the mountain, Weibo said in slight exasperation. However, what Sui Jingcheng and Rongchang saw was the hunchbacked man stomping on Weibo's foot and saying with an unchanged smile, It's just a midnight snack. It's no trouble at all to make. Then let's climb the mountain straight away. There are some matters that we need to explain in detail to Mountain God Wei because we couldn't reveal too much through the messenger flying sword, Sui Jingcheng replied carefully. Zhang Dafeng sighed and forcefully dug his heel into Weibo's boot before twisting it around for a bit. However, Weibo was unfazed as he said to Sui Jingcheng, As you wish. As Rongchang watched this play out, sweat almost formed on his forehead, and his sword heart almost became unstable. The four of them slowly climbed the mountain together. Why are you so disloyal? Zhang Dafeng lowered his voice and grumbled. We need to discuss the proper matters first, Weibo replied with a smile. Is your brother's marriage not a proper matter? Fucking hell. Some of us are drowning to death, while some of us are being parched to death. Zhang Dafeng fumed. The books naturally hold beautiful women, and the paintings naturally hold beauties with strong affection, Weibo replied with a faint smile. 1. Zhang Dafeng sighed in grief and lamented. There's ultimately still something lacking. Weibo patted Zhang Dafeng's shoulder and consoled. Does a handsome man like you need to worry about not being able to find a wife? Zheng Dafeng elbowed Wei Bo and retorted. I would feel extremely confident if I heard this from Chan Ping'an, but coming from you? Sui Jingcheng looked around as she climbed the mountain, fully immersing herself in the environment. This was the home of the senior sword immortal. Meanwhile, Rongchang felt slightly confused, unable to guess the background of the hunchbacked man. His great Tao was clearly severed, turning him into a half-crippled pure martial artist, so why did he have such a close relationship with Wei Bo? Most importantly, the two of them didn't find this strange at all? Sui Jingcheng slowed down when she saw a young girl descending the mountain while practicing fist techniques. Her fist stance looked quite familiar, so Sui Jingcheng started to carefully examine her appearance. She looked okay and she was pretty but not too pretty. Zheng Dafeng smiled and greeted her, saying, Little sister Tsin, you're still practicing fist techniques even though it's so late? You're working far too hard, and big brother Zheng feels like you've become thinner. Tsin Yuanji continued to practice walking meditation, completely focused as she ignored Zheng Dafeng's words. She walked down the mountain. Zheng Dafeng nodded and praised. That's okay, it's correct to ignore big brother Dafeng since you need to remain focused on practicing fist techniques. It's okay as long as you keep big brother Dafeng in your mind. Stop delaying Tsin Yuanji's fist technique practice, Wei Bo said in exasperation. Zheng Dafeng snickered and replied, I'm helping her temper her mental state. Okay? You're not a martial artist, so what the hell do you understand? Where's the true barrier each time this young girl makes a round trip from the mountain peak to the mountain foot while practicing fist techniques? It's right near the entrance at the foot of the mountain. I might look like I'm doing nothing while I sit on the small chair at the entrance, but how many ordinary female martial artists can withstand the killing intent in my eyes and the hidden meaning in my words? A look of realization spread across Wei Bo's face as he nodded and concurred. Yes, you're absolutely correct. Rongchang felt very puzzled. Simply judging by the words and gaze of this hunchbacked man, how had he not been beaten to death yet if he were born and raised in this small town? Or was it because of his provocative tongue that he had invited calamity and suffered severe wounds, catastrophically severing his martial Tao? And it was because of this that he had been reduced to a gatekeeper for Downtrodden Mountain, having no option but to depend on Chan Ping'an and being subject to his whims? Or were there other hidden circumstances, and this hunchbacked man couldn't be judged by his appearance? You truly shouldn't doubt me so quickly, Zheng Dafeng chuckled cheerfully. That woman with the surname Li was unable to withstand the test, no? There'll eventually come a day when Tsin Yuanji wants to thank big brother Dafeng for his good intentions, and at that time she might even wipe tears and snot onto my clothes. Just thinking about this is touching and emotional. Wei Bo couldn't be bothered saying anything else. This time the instability in Rongchang's sword heart was quite clear. Zheng Dafeng faltered and shifted his gaze, asking in puzzlement, Sword Immortal Rong, you're also receiving benefits of the Great Tao? This doesn't make any sense. My methods should only work on females. Rongchang smiled and replied, It's nothing. I've traveled thousands of kilometers from my hometown, so I was simply feeling a little melancholy just then. However, Rongchang no longer dared to view this hunchbacked man as an ordinary person. How could an ordinary martial arts grandmaster instantly detect the subtle ringing of a nascent tier sword cultivator's bonded flying sword in their mind's lake? A young woman who had returned to her hometown from another continent left the ferry station at Oxhorn Mountain and walked into the mountains, making her way to the small town where the county office of the Locust Yellow County was located. She took a few extra glances when she walked past the hill-like True Jewel Mountain, and after entering the small town, she visited her old family home which was located not far from the mountain. The old beast from Sun-Scorched Mountain had jumped on their roof ridge and damaged it before, forcing her family of 4 to temporarily move in with their relatives. Afterward, her mother had grumbled for a long time about using some of their savings to repair the roof. The young woman retrieved a key and opened the door. She then went to a nearby well and drew 2 buckets of water, carefully cleaning both the inside and outside of the house. Only then did she lock the door and walk to the extremely quiet Yang family's medicine shop. Business was difficult, and only 2 attendants remained in the medicine shop. The young boy was Shilingshan, and his senior sister was Su Dian. Shilingshan was resting on the counter and dozing off, while Su Dian was sitting on a long bench and silently cultivating. After breaking through to the 3rd tier, she had received the comment of barrier broken, lightning essence bursting forth, the heavy cavalry slices through the formation from her senior brother Zhang Dafeng. He had said that this was quite outstanding, and that this would help raise the quality of her hero's gall in the future. Zhang Dafeng also encouraged Su Dian to venture through an ancient battlefield ruin in the future, tempering her soul such that she could achieve double the results with half the effort. This would be especially beneficial to her cultivation when she reached the 6th tier. However, Su Dian hadn't felt very happy, and she had instead felt a strong sense of disappointment. This was because she understood that the barrier to the 3rd tier was a major hurdle, but also a huge opportunity at the same time. In the end, she had failed to obtain the title of strongest that she had yearned so deeply for. And now she could only place her hopes in the 4th tier. Su Dian was already taciturn and smiled little to begin with, and thanks to her extremely competitive nature, her inability to become the strongest at the 3rd tier caused her to become increasingly solemn and quiet. She practiced martial arts in an almost frenzied manner every single day, with this training being separated into 3 types: training in the morning, training at night, and training in her dreams. The last type was the most mystical, while the former 2 types were the most effective under the blazing sun and under the round moon, respectively. As for training in her dreams, this involved lighting 3 sticks of incense before she went to bed at night, which would allow her to enter all kinds of weird and wonderful dreams. She could fight against opponents, appear on intense battlefields, be killed in an instant, or struggle to stay alive with every fiber of her being. After her dreams ended, Su Dian wouldn't wake up feeling mentally exhausted and physically tired, and she would instead feel refreshed and invigorated the next morning. These dreams definitely wouldn't affect her morning training and night training. It looked like Shi Lingshan was dozing off, but in reality, he was also cultivating in earnest. The young boy's cultivation method was easier relative to that of his senior sister, and it was a method called wading in water. He would wade through the river of time to temper his physique and soul. Su Dian wasn't aware of her master's true identity, and she was even less privy to her master's true cultivation base. However, there was one thing that Su Dian knew for certain. That was, the cultivation paths of her and her junior brother definitely weren't ordinary. There were many immortals coming and going from the Locust Yellow County now, and a large number of spirits and demons were also assuming human form and appearing in the large mountains to the west. At the same time, locals of the small town and refugees belonging to the Lu clan were continually being recruited as disciples by cultivators. Su Dian speculated that apart from Sage Ruanqiong and his Dragon Spring Sword sect, no one else in this region could compare to her and her junior brother. Su Dian opened her eyes and looked at the unfamiliar customer standing outside the medicine shop. Meanwhile, Shi Lingshan remained completely unmoving, resting on the table and continuing to cultivate. Su Dian had been half an apprentice and half an errand worker in a dragon kiln before, so to put things bluntly, she had simply been doing hard labor. Making porcelain wares in the dragon kilns had always been the most important matter in the small town, especially since these were official kilns belonging to the Great Li Empire and making porcelain wares for imperial use. Su Dian's nickname was Rouge, and she had relied on her uncle's position back then to make a living at the dragon kiln. There were many rules and taboos when it came to making porcelain wares, so as a female, Su Dian had only been able to cut firewood, burn coal, transport raw materials, and complete other physical tasks. She hadn't been allowed to get too close to the kilns when they were active, or else she would have been kicked out of the dragon kiln. Because of her previous work, Su Dian was relatively unfamiliar with the local residents of the small town. As for her junior brother, Shi Lingshan, he was someone who hailed from a well-off family in Peach Leaf Alley, and he had always played with other children from the wealthy clans of the neighborhood and from Fortune Street during his childhood. Because of this, he was also very unfamiliar with the impoverished and shit-filled alleys such as Clay Vase Alley and Apricot Blossom Alley. At most, he was slightly familiar with the many miscellaneous shops on Dragon Riding Alley. The slender and delicate-looking young woman glanced at Su Dian before smiling and asking in a mellow voice, "You're Su Dian, correct?" Su Dian had a very good impression of this customer. Her soft and gentle appearance was just like the rouge and makeup that her uncle had always talked about when he was still alive. Su Dian nodded in response and stood up, asking, "Are you here to purchase medicinal ingredients?" The young woman shook her head and replied, "No, I'm here to look for someone. My father used to work as a shop attendant here, And my younger brother Li Huai always came here to play when he was little. Have you heard about them before? Su Dian's expression changed slightly. Li Huai, that young boy wearing Confucian robes who had seemingly swallowed the courage of 100 lions? How did such a bold and reckless young boy have such a gentle and soft older sister? The young woman standing in front of her looked like a willow branch in spring, with her voice pleasant to the ears and her appearance kind to the eyes. She wasn't the type of beauty that men would fall for at a single glance, but she had an appearance that could be appreciated for a very long time. Even a good-looking young girl like Su Dian found her beautiful. Are you looking for my master? Su Dian asked in a soft voice. The young woman smiled and nodded in response. Su Dian felt slightly conflicted. Right at this moment, however, Old Man Yang appeared at the door to the backyard in a rare scene. He lifted the curtain with his smoking pipe and chuckled. You've arrived? Come on in. Li Lu entered the backyard. Old Man Yang sat on the steps and continued to smoke, while Li Lu casually picked a chair to sit down on. If you have something to say about the new blessed land of Downtrodden Mountain, then you should go ahead and say it. There's no need to be afraid of anything, Old Man Yang said. It looks like many things are affected, but in reality, these are matters that fall within the expected scope and adhere to the rules. This involves supremely lofty mighty figures after all, so they should be tolerant enough when it comes to such matters. The current physical bodies of you people are a restriction, but it at least provides a certain amount of benefit as well. Li Lu nodded and asked, You didn't tell Zheng Dafeng to call me here for just this, right? Ruan Qiong coincidentally looked for me recently, and what he discussed also pertained to the Blessed Lands, Old Man Yang replied. You can review some of the information which is still sitting with me. When you leave, you can visit Divine Elegance Mountain after you visit Downtrodden Mountain. There was a deep and solemn look in Li Lu's eyes. With no Dao remaining, what's the point of focusing on battles between great Dao? Is this not a joke? Old Man Yang asked with a chuckle. If you ask me, I'd say that you should forget about your ancient grudges with her. Of course, I surmise that neither of you will listen to my persuasions, or else things back then. Forget about it. What's in the past is in the past, so there's no point mentioning it again. If we truly delve into it, everyone involved was wrong in one way or another. In any case, even if the two of you truly want to lock horns again, now is not the right time. One was the ruler of the cultivation world. One was a lofty fire goddess. It was simply the case that their great Tao had collapsed, the world around them had changed, and their physical bodies were now different. However, the foundations of their godly bodies still existed. As for why he, the prisoner who was most senior and had the highest status in the world, was still able to cling on to life and survive until today, this was a question that needed to be posed to three people and two gods. Of the two gods, one had decided why sword cultivators possessed the greatest destructive ability, yet found it incredibly difficult to advance to the legendary 14th tier. The other had decided why all of the martial arts paths in the world led to dead ends, and why military and cultivators among chi refiners could enjoy the unique benefit of essentially not being affected by karmic fate. I feel like it's not possible, Li Lu suddenly said. Old Man Yang chuckled coldly and retorted. Who was it back then that claimed those ants could rise to the pinnacle and would possibly succeed? Li Lu remained silent. Indeed, Old Man Yang had been speaking the truth just then. If they truly delved into it, everyone involved had been wrong in one way or another. Old Man Yang tapped the ground with his smoking pipe, giving rise to a small temple that was shrouded in mist. It rolled along the ground before gradually coming to a stop. A small incense person ran out from the temple, earnestly dragging two large plaques along with it. In reality, it was a jade tablet and a seal. Li Lu glanced at the two items and asked with a chuckle, Lu Xianyang, who was borrowed by the pure Confucian Chung clan, will definitely join the Dragon Spring Sword sect? Ruan Qiong feels like there's only a slim chance of Lu Xianyang returning, but in truth the possibility is actually quite big, Old Man Yang replied. The small incense person sprinted over to Li Lu's feet. Li Lu picked up the keys to the small world and the blessed land. She had little interest in them. They were nothing more than old and shattered lands. Li Lu, Ruan Xiao, Li Er, Zheng Dafeng, Fan Junmao, and the others were all slightly different. As for virtuous scholar Zhou Ju from Lakeview Academy, Sun Jiaxu from Old Dragon City, and little Chui from the small immortal force in the northern complete reed continent's treasure basin immortal realm, these individuals were even less capable of comparing to her. The immortal realm inside the painting left behind for the flax robe sect by the 8 divine maidens of Skeleton Shoal's Mural City was also a shattered world. In fact, it could be regarded as one of Li Lu's summer residences, and it was because of this that the Rainbringer divine maiden had felt uneasy upon seeing Li Lu. It was like a petty official from a mortal empire coming across a lofty official from the Ministry of Personnel. This hadn't been a misperception by the Rainbringer divine maiden, and the reality had indeed been such. The positions of the 8 divine maidens from Mural City were roughly equivalent to those of the 6 supervisory divisions in the mortal imperial courts. Of course, it was only similar, with the 8 divine maidens actually possessing slightly greater power. They could patrol heaven and earth and constrain, surveil, and impeach the deities from the various departments. It could be said that their positions were low, but their power was great. Compared to the other people that Old Man Yang had guided step by step to that ancient path, the biggest difference about Li Lu was that she hadn't needed her memories to be unlocked. This was because she had been born with the memories of her past life. For many sect-level immortal forces, they needed to spend a huge amount of resources to look for the reincarnations of their old ancestors following their passing. For example, the sect rejuvenation leader of the Parasol Leaf sect had instructed disciples to venture outside the mountains to search for his mother. However, the reincarnations of these individuals wouldn't necessarily be able to regain their past memories, even if they were found. Similarly, possessing a good aptitude for cultivation didn't necessarily imply that they could definitely return to the pinnacle of the mountains. Li Lu casually put the jade tablet and the seal away. After thinking for a short moment, she sighed and said, "You still don't want me and her to reignite our old grudges." If Chun Ping'an wasn't enough, then there was also Li Huai. If the two of them still weren't enough, then they could also add Lu Xianying. This was a deeply hidden conflict between fire and water, and it was Chun Ping'an who had temporarily stood in for Li Lu to compete against Ruan Xiu. This was because back then, Chun Ping'an was the one who should have obtained the fated opportunity pertaining to the catfish, not Gu Kan. Moreover, why had Ruan Xiu always viewed Chun Ping'an differently and given him special treatment? Things were perhaps becoming increasingly complicated now, but in the beginning, it definitely hadn't been as simple as Ruan Xiu feeling like Chun Ping'an's mind was very pure and limpid. Rather, Ruan Xiu looking at Chun Ping'an at the time had been like an old Taotai salivating as it gazed at the most delicious food in the world. Ruan Xiu had been unable to shift her gaze. Li Huai, the younger brother of Li Lu, was also Qi Jingquan's disciple, and thanks to a stroke of fate, Chun Ping'an had once acted as Li Huai's Dao guardian for a period of time. If Li Lu wanted to settle old grudges with Ruan Xiu, then she needed to first kill Chun Ping'an, someone who possessed a strong innate affinity with water, to completely monopolize that great Dao. However, this was something that Li Huai definitely wouldn't allow, and Li Lu was also unwilling to cause grief for her younger brother. But to not kill Chun Ping'an was an unreliable approach. Thus, Old Man Yang needed to create some legitimate reasons and possibilities for Lu Xianying to return to the Dragon Spring Sword sect. For example, a blessed land that was not part of the 36 small worlds mutually complementing Lu Xianying's ancestral sword scripture. With both Chun Ping'an and Lu Xianying present, the relationship between Downtrodden Mountain and the Dragon Spring Sword sect would only grow closer and closer. Old Man Yang didn't refute anything, but his gaze was cold as he said firmly, "Everyone has made mistakes before, but the two of you made extremely big mistakes." Li Lu didn't feel fearful, nor did she feel remorseful. She looked up at the sky and conceded, "That's probably true. All kinds of mud and impurities might be easily shaken off by you and the others, but you still need to be careful," Old Man Yang suddenly warned. "Otherwise, there will eventually come a day when some unremarkable mud acts like ink paste seeping into the seals, causing you and the others to suffer grave consequences." Li Lu shook her head and replied, "There's no need to say these things to me. I know what I'm doing." She then smiled gracefully and looked at the old man. Old Man Yang couldn't help but chuckle, and it was as if he were finding an excuse for himself as he said, "I've been sitting in this cage for 10,000 years, so am I not allowed to find some entertaining ways to alleviate my boredom?" Li Lu held back a smile and said, "My father is doing well, especially since he needs to leave some martial fortune for the eastern treasured Vile continent. However, my mother didn't actually need to go to the northern complete reed continent. Old Man Yang remained silent, with his expression slightly dark. His mood would turn sour whenever he thought about that woman who was like a bitter shrew who ate several kilograms of arsenic every single day. She was someone detested by gods and ghosts alike, akin to the feces of flies and censors. Just taking an extra glance at her would be soiling one's eyes. Li Huai and his mother were different from his father, Li Er, and his older sister Li Lu. The two of them were only ordinary people. Of course, Li Huai was human, but he was definitely no ordinary human. There didn't exist any other child in the world who had fortunes lining up for them to collect. Huang Ting from the Parasol Leaf Continent's Peace and Tranquility Mountain, and He Xiaoyang from the Divine Edict sect were both regarded as cultivators who possessed unparalleled fortune in their continents. Compared to Li Huai's peerless dumb luck, however, it appeared as the young boy's fortunes were even more unfathomable. Huang Ting and He Xiaoyang still needed to contemplate how they should firmly grab their fated opportunities, lest fortune and disaster come hand in hand. Meanwhile, did Li Huai need to consider these matters at all? He was the type of person who would naturally attract fortune, and he might even worry about these fortunes being too heavy or not looking nice. With this in mind, Old Man Yang could make some more exceptions for Li Huai, ones that didn't pertain to any business transactions. The old man truly liked this young boy after all. The Jewel Small World had existed for a very long time, but only a very small number of people had been allowed to enter the backyard of the Yang family's medicine shop. Children like Li Huai were thus very rare. As for Li Huai's mother, it was precisely because she was an ordinary mortal human that the old man couldn't be bothered making a fuss with her. However, if she were Peach Leaf Ali's Xieshir or Clay Vase Ali's Chao Shi, if they had dared to act like Li Huai's mother, would they still have managed to leave the Jewel Small World? Old Man Yang fell silent for a moment before saying, Chen Ping'an has started to secretly investigate matters pertaining to bonded porcelains. He's very stealthy, and he hasn't left any clues or traces. Li Lu didn't have any thoughts about this. She was roughly aware of some secrets, and this was a matter that involved an extremely complicated scheme in the mountains. The Yang family's medicine shop was naturally involved in this matter, but it had adhered to the rules and hadn't purposely targeted Chen Ping'an. It had simply split the spoils with the Imperial Song clan of the Great Li Empire. In the beginning, the production of bonded porcelains had been a supreme ability of Old Man Yang's, and it could even be claimed that the rise of the Great Li Empire could be attributed to the transaction that had taken place in the Jewel Small World. It was thanks to this that the Great Li Empire had managed to prosper and slowly claw its way to the top. Thus, Old Man Yang's praise of Cui Chan's ability in the Tao of Souls was already the greatest acknowledgement in the world. It could be said that apart from Old Man Yang, the only people supremely talented in this Tao were Cui Chan and Cui Dongshan, the couple from the Ma clan who had managed to control the dragon kills even though they lived in Apricot Blossom Alley. Ma Kuxuan's parents were deeply involved in the shattering of Chen Ping'an's bonded porcelain. This also pertained to Ma Lanhua, the river guardian of the Dragon Whisker River who had now been promoted to the position of river goddess, yet still had no gold statue, no temple, and naturally no incense offerings. She was Ma Kuxuan's grandmother, and the wicked old woman had only shown a rare hint of conscience regarding this matter. In fact, she had even tried everything in her power to stop her son and her daughter-in-law. However, the couple had been completely devoured by greed, and Ma Lanhua had ultimately failed to stop their plan. Ma Kuxuan had woken with a start at the time, allowing him to learn a small portion of the truth. Thus, this prodigy, who had pretended to be mentally challenged during much of his childhood, always paid special attention to Chen Ping'an, the imperial concubine of the Great Li Empire, now the Empress Dowager, and the late emperor had both become involved in these matters for the sake of Song Jisun and for the sake of the Great Li Empire's fortune. Meanwhile, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan had gone with the flow, and played a game of Go with Qi Jingchan regarding this matter. If one only focused on the final result, then Cui Chan had indeed played a godly game. Regarding who had purchased Chen Ping'an's bonded porcelain back then, why it had been shattered, and how many immortal coins the Great Li Empire had paid in compensation to the porcelain buyer, Li Lu didn't know too much about these matters, nor was she willing to investigate these matters that were unrelated to her. Generally speaking, people gambling on bonded porcelain wouldn't pay an overly low price for children hailing from Clay Vase Alley, Seeing that this impoverished alley had once produced Chao Shi, a sword immortal responsible for overseeing a mighty suppressing pagoda in the southern world continent. This would add a premium but not a very big one. Because Clay Vase Alley had already produced Chao Shi before, the late emperor of the Great Li Empire, the imperial court, and the buyer of Changping'an's bonded porcelain all hadn't regarded the shattering of Changping'an's bonded porcelain as a very important matter. However, it was difficult to say whether this was still the case now that Changping'an had slowly ascended to his current height. Perhaps the buyer might feel a strong urge to raise this matter again, finding all kinds of reasons and excuses to negotiate with the new emperor of the Great Li Empire. Changping'an's bonded porcelain had been shattered, yet he was still able to achieve such great feats and climb to his current state. If his bonded porcelain hadn't been shattered, and the buyer had brought him out of the jewel small world and greatly invested in his cultivation, then according to precedent, would Changping'an not have been guaranteed to become an upper 5-tier cultivator? Taking this into account, the compensation from the imperial court of the Great Li Empire back then most definitely hadn't been fair. Of course, if the buyer hailed from an immortal force in the Great Li Empire, then they presumably wouldn't dare to say anything to the imperial court right now. They would only dare to grumble in their minds. If they hailed from an immortal force belonging to another continent, however, especially those juggernaut sect-level forces, and especially those belonging to the northern complete reed continent, then the new emperor of the Great Li Empire, who was yet to fully establish his rule, would almost certainly have to pay his father's debt. Changping'an is a very friendly and easygoing person, Li Lu suddenly said. However, Changping'an is also a very frightening person at the same time, she added. Old Man Yang smiled and said, being able to receive such an assessment from you, it's clear that Changping'an hasn't been wasting his time all these years. Li Lu frowned and said, once Changping'an learns the truth, his first enemy will be right beside Downtrodden Mountain and Clay Vase Alley. His first enemy would be Apricot Blossom Alley's Ma clan. His second enemy would be the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan. Yet, Ma Kuxuan was clearly a wager that Old Man Yang attached great importance to. The old man snickered and replied, if Ma Kuxuan is killed by someone at the same age, someone whose bonded porcelain has already been shattered, then he would have saved me from making more gambles in the future. If that's the case, then I should be thanking Changping'an instead. Li Lu sighed in response. This was the old man's business ideology. That Taoist branchmaster actually spoke many bold truths back then, Old Man Yang remarked with a smile. However, has Changping'an understood these truths yet? For example, those who do good deeds aren't necessarily good people, and those who do bad deeds aren't necessarily bad people. Old Man Yang looked up at the sky and continued, do you know why the Buddhist sect is seemingly completely uninterested in the direction and fate of the jewel small world? Li Lu remained silent. Old Man Yang answered his own question saying, let's assume that the decline of the Dharma is arriving. Which of the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought do you think will suffer the most? The Taoist sect, Li Lu replied. Once there's no path to ascend and no spiritual energy to cultivate, all of the cultivation methods in the world will become completely ineffective. At that time, the Taoist sect will be subject to the most difficult situation. The Taoist sect's profound philosophy of inaction, and following the natural flow of things might transform into literal inaction and fecklessness. To the Taoist sect, this might very likely be a case of the earliest arriving separation of the world and its deities. On the other hand, the Confucian sect and the Buddhist sect can continue to pass down their teachings and exist for tens of thousands of years. It's just that the radiance of their teachings will be far dimmer than before. Old Man Yang nodded and explained, and that's why the Taoist senior brother is worried, and that's why the Taoist third brother personally acted as a Tao guardian for his senior brother, and paid a visit to the jewel small world, disguising himself as a fortune teller to keep a firm eye on Qi Jingchun. Why didn't Mr. Qi use the hairpin gifted to him by his master? Li Lu asked. That's a critical item of that stinky Taoist temple master, so the old scholar was naturally acting out of the goodness of his heart, Old Man Yang replied. Even I failed to notice the origin of that hairpin in the beginning, and Qi Jingchun most likely didn't notice it either. Afterward, that hairpin only revealed a sliver of its power when Qi Jingchun was boldly facing off against the heavenly tribulation. The stinky Taoist temple master naturally had thoughts of repulsing the Tao ancestor, But it was a pity that Qi Jingchun was unwilling to jump from one perilous go board to another perilous go board. Since death was inevitable, he resolutely severed all of the remaining paths. A look of emotion and reminiscence appeared on Old Man Yang's face as he remarked, "Back then, it was this type of person who overthrew our world." He then smiled and continued, "Don't feel like the world is a chaotic mess right now. When a great calamity truly befalls the world, many such people will step forward bravely. This is thanks to the teachings of the Confucian sect, which people always like to deride mortal humans as foolish. It's those in the mountains followed by scholars. In reality, the most impressive aspect of the Confucian sect is people doing good but not knowing that they're doing good, and people doing evil and knowing clearly that they're doing evil. Children looking after elderly parents, parents teaching their children, the relationships between rulers and their subjects, between masters and disciples, between families and friends, between neighbors and acquaintances. The teachings of the Confucian sect are like porcelain wares, spreading throughout the world and leaving an impression on everyone. The porcelain wares shatter easily, but the fundamental nature of the clay ingredients remains unchanging." Old Man Yang thought for a moment and said, "Li Huai sent some letters to the shop before, and one of the phrases I came across was, 'A cold chill seeping into the mountain core, the trees and vegetation gaunt yet resilient.' Too, what do you think? Isn't this very interesting? Why did a sinister old woman like Apricot Blossom Alley's Ma Lanhua try to stop her son and daughter-in-law from committing evil to seek wealth? This is the complexity of the human heart. These are the unwritten rules of the Confucian sect restraining people's thoughts and actions. Many of these principles have already embedded themselves in the minds of everyone in the majestic world." What area of study was Mr. Qi investigating during his 60 years in the Jewel's small world? Li Lu asked in curiosity. He was naturally perusing books from the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought, Old Man Yang replied. Qi Jingchun could live up to the praise of having a very broad scope of reading. In private, however, he was mainly focused on the principles of the 3 teachings, foretelling, interrelationships, and laws. Li Lu sighed in response. He was a scholar, so why had he voluntarily brought himself so much hardship and trouble? Old Man Yang retrieved some tobacco. Li Lu smiled knowingly when she saw this. This tobacco was most likely a present from her younger brother, Li Huai. The reason for this was very simple. This tobacco clearly looked very cheap. After some more casual conversation, Li Lu stood up and disappeared in a flash, changing her mind and deciding to visit Divine Elegance Mountain before she visited Downtrodden Mountain. On the cliff face of Divine Elegance Mountain, there were the characters, "Heaven creates divine elegance," engraved from the top to the bottom. A girl wearing green and with a ponytail was sitting on the first horizontal stroke of the character Heaven, and it was as if she were sitting on a railing in the sky and peering down at the world. 3. She slowly ate her desserts. Li Lu appeared beside her. Yet Ruanxiu still didn't turn her head. Li Lu squatted down and gazed into the distance, casually tossing 2 items to the young woman in green. Ruanxiu caught the 2 items and put away her desserts. One is a small world, the paddy field small world, and one is a blessed land, the smoke mist blessed land. The small world is slightly inferior to the 10 large worlds and 36 small worlds, while the blessed land is a ready-made medium-grade blessed land. It's neither good nor bad, and it can potentially advance to the high grade if you're willing to put some money into it. However, there's no human in the blessed land, and there are only mountain spirits, grass spirits, and flower spirits. You should be aware that the old man doesn't like to interact with other people, but according to the agreement, he'll ask you to do 2 things in the future. At that time you can decide whether or not you do those things and how exactly you do them based on your own mood. Ruanxiu spread her palm open and looked down. The jade tablet was inscribed with the characters, "Not an azure dragon supervising the waters, the land-forming ditches and the water-forming fields." Hence the small world being named the Paddy Field Small World. For its alternate name was the Green Sprout Small World. The side of the seal was inscribed with the characters, "Time squandered in the world, smoke and mist lingering in the area." Hence the blessed land being named the Smoke Mist Blessed Land. 5. Blessed lands were useful for land, people and natural treasures, while small worlds were useful for cultivation and attaining Tao. This was literally a case of worlds apart. Of course, the best-case scenario was an immortal force possessing both a small world and a blessed land at the same time. For example, the Divine Edict sect owned the Limpid Pond Blessed Land, and it also owned an additional small world. It was just that the small world was of a lower grade, thus not being one of the 36 small worlds like the Jewel Small World and the Dragon Palace Small World. A small world was a small world, after all, and apart from having even more spiritual energy than ordinary treasured lands with abundant spiritual energy, the most important thing about them was the many more mystical qualities they possessed. For example, there was the aura of the Great Tao, and there were some golden matters accumulated and washed by the flow of time. They were only small specks, yet they could fill an entire room with radiance. The Paddy Field Small World also had some mystical abilities similar to enchanted picture scrolls, so it was suitable for Lu Xianyang's sword practice during sleep to a certain degree. In reality, Old Man Yang possessed small worlds and blessed lands that were even more suitable for cultivating that sword scripture. However, now wasn't the right time to take them out. When doing business with others, one definitely shouldn't show too much eagerness. Otherwise, one wouldn't get a good deal. Ruan Xiu frowned and asked, "There aren't damaged mystical realms of the fire element?" "The old man won't give them to you even if he has any," Li Lu replied. "Even if you dare to accept them, your father will still return them to Old Man Yang. I most certainly won't make another trip for this kind of matter either." "Thank you," Ruan Xiu said with a nod. Li Lu didn't respond. Ruan Xiu retrieved her silken pouch and desserts again, asking, "Do you want some?" Li Lu hesitated for a moment before grabbing a small piece and popping it into her mouth. Ruan Xiu smiled with squinted eyes, appearing slightly happy as she said, "You can eat this dessert one more time before I beat you to death in the future." "I'll eat the dessert and then you'll eat me, so you'll pretty much be the one eating the dessert anyway. This is quite a good deal for you," Li Lu said with a chuckle. Ruan Xiu put away her desserts and gazed into the distance with a smile, remarking, "But it's possible that you might be the one eating me instead. I feel like this is fairly good. To have few restrictions and to eat when we want to. Boiling water and searing seas, with all matter in the world free to eat. I don't remember anything about the past anymore. Who won and who lost the final battle between us?" Ruan Xiu asked. "We both lost," Li Lu replied with an indifferent expression. "There are clearly pawns controlled by other forces among the 12 unofficial disciples of the Dragon Spring Sword sect. So why are you purposely choosing to ignore them?" Li Lu asked. "Other people have placed a few measly ants in the chicken coop, so is there any need for me to deal with them?" Ruan Xiu replied with a baffled expression. Li Lu smiled upon hearing this. Such pitiful ants. Among them, Xieling was perhaps the most pitiful. "Did you not come across any familiar faces in the northern complete reed continent?" Ruan Xiu asked in a seemingly casual manner. "I brushed past him at a place called Malicious Ghost Valley at Skeleton Shoal, but I didn't go out of my way to greet him," Li Lu replied. "In any case, we'll meet again at Lion Peak in the future." "Oh, then you're quite lacking as a person," Ruan Xiu commented. "Care for a fight in the smoke mist blessed land?" Li Lu asked with a cold chuckle. "No thanks. That's clearly a terrible deal for me. Not only will I clearly lose, but fighting inside the blessed land will also cause its spiritual energy to disperse and many great demons to die. There's absolutely no point." Ruan Xiu shook her head and continued, "With a personality like yours, I must have genuinely been a very good-tempered person before to have not pummeled you to death." Li Lu lay down on her back, placing her hands behind her head and using them as a pillow as she responded, "Your temper was indeed quite good." Ruan Xiu glanced up at the sky, looking at the two people who were soaring on the wind and traveling south. However, she quickly retracted her gaze and didn't stop them that a man had just arrived at the immortal ferry station of Oxhorn Mountain on his clan's immortal ship, and following beside him was a maidservant called Yer. The two of them soared on the wind and directly made their way to Downtrodden Mountain. He had a sword tablet crafted by the Dragon Spring Sword sect hanging by his waist, and this was something he had purchased from a local immortal force during his previous visit to Downtrodden Mountain. Back then, he hadn't been able to bring himself to rely on his status to purchase the sword tablet for its original price, although this had nothing to do with his sense of morality and justice. The person hadn't been willing to sell it for double the price either, so he had directly quadrupled the price and completed a happy transaction with the seller. Even so, the sword tablet had only cost him a single grain rain coin. They descended from the sky after reaching the foot of downtrodden mountain. "Brother Da Feng," he shouted loudly. A hunchbacked man sitting on a chair and basking in the sun in front of his residence immediately stood up and ran over, greeting warmly. "Oh, if it isn't Brother Zhou Fei!" Standing beside Jiang Shangzhen was a breathtakingly beautiful young woman. She was none other than Yuer, who had been brought out from the lotus flower-blessed land. After seeing her, Zhang Dafeng remarked with emotion, "You're drowning to death, huh? Can I ascend the mountain?" Jiang Shangzhen asked. Zhang Dafeng nodded and replied, "Of course you can. However, Downtrodden Mountain has been short on funds recently, so there's a new rule in place stating that all visitors ascending the mountain need to pay a small fee. Since it's Brother Zhou Fei, I'll shamelessly bend the rules this one time and allow Brother Zhou Fei to pay whatever amount he sees fit. In any case, you're half a member of Downtrodden Mountain and almost became a guest elder, so feel free to pay however much you want." Jiang Shangzhen chuckled and retrieved 1 grain rain coin, placing it in Zhang Dafeng's palm. Zhang Dafeng placed the immortal coin into his sleeve and remarked, "Oh my, there's no need for this. This is a bit too much." Yuer was extremely clever and quick-witted, yet looking at the shameless hunchbacked man's response, she was almost unable to wrap her head around what was going on. Zhang Dafeng accompanied Jiang Shangzhen up the mountain, asking, "What brings you here this time?" Jiang Shangzhen smiled and replied, "I came here to express my gratitude to Downtrodden Mountain. It's all thanks to your mountain master that Bamboo Scroll Lake was able to gain a sword cultivator guest elder at the unpolished jade tier. Additionally, I heard that Mountain God Wei hosted a second night travel banquet, yet I missed the ceremony again. This riddled me with guilt, so I decided that I had to personally visit Downtrodden Mountain no matter what, firstly to express gratitude and secondly to offer my apologies." A new sect called the True Realm Sect had been established at Bamboo Scroll Lake, and this was a major development that everyone in the mountains of the Eastern Treasured Vile continent had heard about. If it weren't for the deafening sound of hooves thundering across the continent, this piece of news would have definitely been the subject of spirited conversations between cultivators in the mountains for a very long time. The True Realm Sect was a lower sect of the Jade Tablet Sect, currently the largest immortal sect in the Parasol Leaf continent. The chief guest elder was Lu Laocheng, the only upper 5-tier vagrant cultivator of the Eastern Treasured Vile continent. Apart from him, the other guest elders of the True Realm sect also included Cyan Gorge Island's Lu Jimao. In addition, a group of powerful cultivators from the Jade Tablet sect had also traveled over to settle down at Bamboo Scroll Lake. And now Li Kai, a female sword immortal from the northern Complete Reed continent, had also become a guest elder of the True Realm sect. The rise of this lower sect was rapid and vigorous. An increasing number of cultivators around the Eastern Treasured Vile continent started to turn their gazes toward the Divine Edict sect. They were very curious about whether the powerful local force and the rapidly rising new force would openly clash with each other, or whether there would be many hidden undercurrents surging under the surface. Of course, the latter option would be far less exciting than the former option of powerful cultivators bashing each other to death. Sect leader Qi Zhen of the Divine Edict sect was a 12th-tier heavenly lord, and he had also been bestowed a celestial tool by a branch master of the Taoist sect. Moreover, the Divine Edict sect was also a lower sect supported by a more powerful immortal sect in the Middle-earth Divine continent. In fact, Qi Zhen's junior brother seemingly held an important position in the upper sect right now. In any case, according to the speculations of the cultivators in the Eastern Treasured Vile continent, the True Realm sect would definitely expand its territory in a very careful manner over the next 100 years. The Imperial Song clan of the Great Li Empire wouldn't allow another supremely powerful sect to establish itself in the Eastern Treasured Vile continent. In reality, the True Realm sect was indeed abiding by the rules and regulations. Even when dealing with the many islands of Bamboo Scroll Lake, it had only used those bloody and iron-fisted methods in the very beginning, viciously punishing those who dared to resist. Now, however, it was already starting to mellow and revert to less violent methods, and some clever cultivators and islands were already starting to reap the rewards. They discovered that following Lu Jimao's restructuring of Bamboo Scroll Lake, and ignoring the restrictions born from the rules and regulations of the immortal force, the strength and wealth of their islands were actually growing instead of shrinking. Moreover, the most interesting aspect was that the most lawless region of the eastern treasured vile continent, one that was filled with all kinds of people and vagrant cultivators, had seemingly transformed overnight, with many people in the region mysteriously becoming official immortals. In fact, they were official immortals of a sect-level immortal force. During this time, Bejeweled Hairpin Island had attempted to move out of Bamboo Scroll Lake, and the True Realm sect had especially carved out several islands with undulating mountains and waters, yet didn't make any decisions on their ownership. At the same time, a powerful cultivator of the sect suddenly started to cultivate in seclusion. Of course, all of these were minor matters. Zhu Lian came out to greet Jiang Shangzhen, and the two of them enjoyed a hearty conversation. Jiang Shangzhen offered 2 extremely valuable immortal treasures as late presents for the 2-night travel banquets that he had missed, asking Zhu Lian to deliver them to Cloud Drape Mountain's Weibo. In addition to these, Jiang Shangzhen initially planned to offer 2 more valuable immortal treasures to Downtrodden Mountain's young mountain master, thanking him for helping the True Realm sect recruit an unpolished Jade-tier guest elder. However, Zhu Lian remarked that the guest elder was an unpolished Jade-tier sword immortal, and one from the northern complete reed continent at that. As such, just 2 immortal treasures from Brother Zhou Fei seemed like too little. 3 would be more appropriate. Sitting on a stone chair in the courtyard, Jiang Shangzhen slapped his thigh and exclaimed that it was truly a crime for him to forget this matter. And thus he directly retrieved 2 immortal treasures. Yer could barely bring herself to watch on. After leaving the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, she had witnessed Jiang Shangzhen's tactics in the Jade Tablet sect, appearing haughty on the surface but actually being very calculated. She had also followed Jiang Shangzhen to the Cloud Cave Blessed Land, witnessing his cold and heartless nature, as he killed those rebellious earth immortals of the Blessed Land. He hadn't so much as blinked while crushing those cultivators as if he were crushing ants. And finally, she had accompanied Jiang Shangzhen to Bamboo Scroll Lake. Even though he had never issued any specific commands, appearing like a leader who was delegating all of his tasks and not caring about anything at all, Yer, who was familiar with the management of large immortal forces due to her background in the demonic sect, had seen formless signs of Jiang Shangzhen's social skills in every interaction and matter. This caused Yer to feel increasingly puzzled. Was that otherworldly immortal with the surname Chan worthy of being taken so seriously by Jiang Shangzhen? In any case, Chan Ping'an wasn't even present at Downtrodden Mountain right now. The current Yer was no longer a naive frog at the bottom of the well like she had been in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land. She had already witnessed the scenes at the pinnacle of the entire Parasol Leaf continent. Zheng Dafeng was extremely amused upon seeing this. How interesting! Grey Vale Mountain, Cinnabar Mountain, Exuberant Dawn Peak, and Aobac Ridge, all 4 of these mountains subordinate to Downtrodden Mountain now, had their own subjugation treasures. The most clever thing about these presents from Brother Zhou Fei was that the 4 valuable subjugation treasures could be used as supporting treasures in the future. In other words, if Downtrodden Mountain found more suitable immortal treasures to safeguard those mountains in the future, today's help during a time of great need would naturally transform into tomorrow's icing on the cake. Of course, there was a critically important factor to the sect leader of the True Realm sect being able to display such cleverness: wealth. However, this was also understandable. The Cloud Cave Blessed Land had a resounding reputation, so much so that even the incredibly haughty cultivators from the Middle-earth Divine Continent frequently visited. It was a huge source of income for the Jade Tablet sect. Thus Zhou Fei was extorting a fat pig right now, Zhou Fei's pig. One was willing to perform the extortion, and one was willing to fall victim to the extortion, leaving both parties happy. Perhaps this considerate and warm-hearted Brother Zhou Fei might even be feeling displeased with how little and how slowly Zhu Lian was extorting him. Since they were at Suckup Mountain, Downtrodden Mountain, the 2 of them naturally needed to have a competition to determine whose Dao power was superior. Jiang Shangzhen had been confident when coming to Downtrodden Mountain, yet he surprisingly conceded defeat in the end. This was because Zhu Lian had a trump card, that remark from Pei Qian, Chan Ping'an's opening disciple. The competition was quickly settled following this decisive blow. Jiang Shangzhen was extremely impressed. Yer felt very awkward as she stood there and listened on. Zhu Lian and Jiang Shangzhen finally started to discuss the proper matters. Yer was extremely reserved. This was because the gaze of that hunchbacked man truly caused her to feel uncomfortable. When they occasionally caught each other's gazes, however, Yer couldn't say that she felt disgusted. This caused her to feel slightly exasperated and helpless. Yer decided that she wouldn't visit Downtrodden Mountain again in the future. I want 20% of the Lotus Root Blessed Land's profit, and with no limit on the time period. In other words, a permanent share of the profits. Jiang Shangzhen raised 2 fingers and continued, "My offer is this. Firstly, the True Realm sect will lend 1,000 grain rain coins to Downtrodden Mountain. The sect will lend another 2,000 grain rain coins to Downtrodden Mountain after the Lotus Root Blessed Land becomes a medium-grade blessed land. We'll lend a further 3,000 grain rain coins after it becomes a high-grade blessed land. None of these loans will come with any interest. However, Chun Ping'an and Downtrodden Mountain must repay these loans to the True Realm sect within 100 years, 500 years, and 1,000 years respectively. Otherwise, there'll be a fine on top of the base amount. As for whether these loans are repaid using immortal coins or through lending us people, the 2 parties can discuss this further in the future. We won't go into any detail for the moment. Secondly, I'll relocate people from the Cloud Cave Blessed Land to the Lotus Root Blessed Land, and these people will be responsible for helping Downtrodden Mountain take care of various chores. Thirdly, I can directly choose 6 islands located in the fringe regions of Bamboo Scroll Lake to gift to Downtrodden Mountain. Gift, not loan." Julien smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Jiang Shangzhen was in no hurry either. As things stand right now, immortal coins are worth the most while people are worth the least. However, it's difficult to say whether this will remain the case for the foreseeable future, Julien suddenly said. Brother Zhou Cloud Cave Blessed Land is large and has a wealth of natural treasures, and this is naturally very impressive. On the other hand, the Lotus Root Blessed Land is small and far inferior to the Cloud Cave Blessed Land. In terms of population, however, the Southern Garden Nation has 20 million people, while the Pinesong Nation and the 2 other nations have 40 million people in total. This isn't a small number. Jiang Shangzhen shook his head and waved his sleeve, immediately forming an isolated area and replying slowly, "If it were an outsider, someone like old sect leader Suan, perhaps they would believe your words. However, it's a shame for you that I'm an otherworldly immortal, who's just walked out from the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, and I've roughly guessed the plans of that old temple master as well. So, apart from the Southern Garden Nation, the souls of the paper humans in the Pinesong Nation and the other nations will be extremely frail and fragmented in the short term. The fortune of the mountains and waters will be even thinner, so much so that they can almost be disregarded. Only the Southern Garden Nation is tangible, and can make up for these shortcomings. Which is to say, the people and matters outside the Southern Garden Nation truly aren't worth much right now. They're not worth anything at all. The only thing that can be done is to wait, and the longer we wait, the more valuable these people and matters will become. And that's why I stressed the point of this being a permanent deal with no time limit." Julien didn't accept or reject the offer, instead smiling and saying, "A permanent 20% cut of the Blessed Land's profit is a bit much." However, this exchange caused Julien to hold Brother Zhou in higher regard. This was called guessing the plans of the heavens, and if one guessed correctly, then this was their ability and something that needed to be acknowledged. At the same time, however, Jiang Shangzhen actually had a very similar view to Julien. Julien was also gambling on the future of the great trend to push for a better deal. More importantly, the other party had also gambled correctly. Jiang Shangzhen retracted the isolated area and stood up, saying, "I'm going to stroll around for a while first, and I'll leave Downtrodden Mountain when I receive a solid reply to my offer. In any case, Bamboo Scroll Lake will remain the same shitty way, regardless of whether I'm present or not." Jiang Shangzhen and Yer soared through the sky and traveled to the provincial city of the Dragon Province, previously the prefectural city of the Dragon Spring Prefecture. He planned to find a few playmates of similar ages for the child whom he had brought from the northern complete reed continent to Bamboo Scroll Lake. Yer, the maidservant beside him, was evidently too old and too dumb. Zheng Dafeng saw Julien's inquisitive gaze. He smiled and explained, "The mighty figure whom I invited should arrive very soon, and they'll help us drive a better bargain with Jiang Shangzhen." Their helper arrived on cue. A young woman gracefully hovered into the small courtyard. Zheng Dafeng chuckled and complimented, "Little Willow, You've grown up to be so remarkably beautiful. Too. Greetings, Uncle Zhang. Li Lu replied with a smile. Julien didn't make any polite small talk, and he directly started to explain the matters pertaining to the lotus root blessed land to this unfamiliar young woman. He explained everything regardless of how big or small the matter, painting a picture of the current situation in the four nations. As for Li Lu's identity and background, Julien didn't care about these matters at all. As the gatekeeper of Downtrodden Mountain, Zhang Dafeng would naturally have these things under control. Li Lu didn't beat around the bush either, asking Julien to call Wei Bo over. She then opened the parasol leaf umbrella and entered the lotus root blessed land together with Julien. The two people, a far-roaming tier martial artist and a powerful cultivator who had casually advanced to the nascent tier, peered down at the blessed land. Li Lu pursed her lips and remarked, as expected of the stinky Taoist priest, his Tao power has become much more profound than before, and it's no wonder that he dares to run over to challenge people in the heavenly world. Julien sat down cross-legged, completely ignoring Li Lu's comment. Li Lu pointed at the vast expanse of mountains and rivers beneath them and said slowly, according to the explanation from the past, the changes in this blessed land can be described as the mountains and rivers changing colors. Back then, the heavens of this blessed land used a paramount mystical ability to create a region beyond the southern garden nation, one with a form similar to the white paper blessed land and an aura similar to the incense fire blessed land. To put it simply, all of the living beings outside the southern garden nation, trees and vegetation included, are nothing more than white paper. They can continue to live, but they've already lost all of their so-called intent. In other words, these pieces of white paper are unable to nurture a single speck of incense essence no matter how devout they are, and no matter how they pray to the deities. Even so, this doesn't stop them from reincarnating in these new blessed lands. As long as the spiritual energy in this blessed land continues to increase, with the southern garden nation also enjoying more and more incense offerings, all of the paper will grow thicker as a result, eventually allowing them to be indistinguishable from genuine living beings. In fact, they'll even possess the ability to cultivate or become deities. They'll transform from colorful paintings into realistic line work, Julien summarized in a calm voice. This is a fair assessment, Li Lu replied with a smile. She then focused her gaze and pointed at several areas, continuing, the so-called otherworldly immortals have already retreated from this shattered blessed land, and the cultivators who had already started to ascend the mountains are clearly no longer in the lotus root blessed land. Take for example the Lake Mountain faction previously led by Eugenie. That area in the Pine Song Nation is extremely glaring, with a complete lack of mountain and water fortune. This is the result of that old Taoist priest taking a fancy to Eugenie, with Eugenie most likely in one of the 4 genuine fragments of the lotus flower blessed land. Lu Tai is another example. Do you see that scholarly clan in the capital of the southern garden nation? There's also a huge blank space there, contrasting starkly with everything around it. This clan definitely produced someone whom the old Taoist priest found interesting. Thus, the rough ownership of the 4 fragments of the lotus flower blessed land is already very clear. The owners are Chan Ping and Eugenie, the first person to successfully switch to the path of cultivation in the history of the lotus root blessed land, Lu Tai, the otherworldly immortal who ruled the demonic sects, and the scholarly clan whose scripture library Chan Ping'an visited twice. Julien didn't so much as take a single glance at these locations as he scratched his head and chuckled. I'm not a mountain god or a water god, so I can't see those phenomena of heaven and earth. Li Lu smiled and said, don't test me. There's no need to. And be careful of gilding the lily. Okay, Julien replied with a faint smile. Chun Ping'an will suffer an even more miserable death if you're a go-piece of that stinky Taoist priest, Li Lu commented. Julien placed his fists on his knees, leaning forward slightly as the wind brushed against him. Since we were fortunate enough to be born as humans, we should speak like proper humans and act like proper humans. Otherwise, what's the point of this journey through the human world? Julien squinted his eyes and continued slowly. I was unable to stop heaven and earth from giving birth to me, but I have the ability to decide how I eventually die. Li Lu turned around, finally observing this pure martial artist, who was wearing a face mask, carefully for the first time. Julien, your great Tao is within reach. Julien looked up and faced the extremely dangerous young woman, remarking, Miss Lu, it's a true shame that you're not coming to Downtrodden Mountain. Li Lu felt slightly puzzled, but she couldn't be bothered trying to figure out the answer. That being the case, she continued to explain the key workings and taboos of blessed lands to Zhu Lian. Her understanding of these matters was no inferior to Jiang Shangzhen's. The reason for this was very simple. Looking back at history, and disregarding their original Great Tao, Li Lu had still managed several blessed lands before. Among them, one small world and one blessed land, the Middle Earth Divine Continent's Ripple Small World and the Flowing Dawn Continent's Emerald Tide Blessed Land, had originally belonged to the 36 small worlds and 72 blessed lands. However, these two places had suffered even worse fates than the fallen and shattered Jewel Small World. With both of them completely broken and forgotten, Pei Qian had been cultivating in seclusion for the past few days. She had been doing the same thing both day and night. She was sitting in front of a study table on the first floor of the bamboo building, with her head buried in sheets of paper as she earnestly transcribed texts. She couldn't be too quick and hasty. She could only write slowly and carefully, making sure every single character was legible and proper. Both Chan Rushu, the little girl in pink who was now a young steward of the mountain, and Zhou Mili, the little water monster who was committed to becoming the right guardian of Downtrodden Mountain's bamboo building, accompanied Pei Qian as she transcribed texts in the bamboo building. They brought her tea and water, also massaging her shoulders and back from time to time. At noon one day, Pei Qian finally laid her calligraphy brush down in a careful manner, standing up and pretending to take a deep breath as she announced, "The grand job is complete." "You've really finished transcribing everything?" Chen Rushu asked. Pei Qian shot a sideways glance at her and replied, "Not only have I repaid the debt, but I've even learned from Big Sister Baoping and transcribed an additional 10 days' worth of text." She then crossed her arms and chuckled coldly. "Starting from the training sessions tomorrow, Senior Chui will understand that a completely focused Pei Qian is completely different from a Pei Qian that he can casually lecture and criticize." Chen Rushu wanted to say something, but she couldn't help but hesitate. Forget about it. Everything will be over in a single punch anyway. With this in mind, she decided against raining on Pei Qian's parade. Zhou Mili hurriedly raised her hands and clapped as quickly as she could. Pei Qian lay down on the study table that was filled with a mountain of transcriptions, playing with some of her treasures for a while before putting them away and walking out from behind the table, saying that she was going to take Chan Rushu and Zhou Mili out to relax their minds. Chan Rushu took some more roasted seeds, while Zhou Mili held the hiking pole. Pei Qian swaggered to the old cook's residence, looking for a young woman, her master's future wife, whom her master had tricked over from the northern complete reed continent. She was surprisingly not at home. Thus, Pei Qian went to look for the old cook instead. However, a dog suddenly dashed out when she was halfway there, and Pei Qian immediately lunged over and pushed the dog's head into the ground with her palm, grabbing its mouth with her other hand and deftly twisting it around, forcing the dog to turn its head. Pei Qian squatted down and asked, "Are you trying to rebel? Why haven't you appeared for so long? Explain yourself. I can spare your life if you give me a good explanation." The dog could only whimper in response. Pei Qian twisted her hand, causing the dog's head to instantly turn in another direction. She then nodded and praised, "What courage! You're able to remain silent even in front of a peerless mighty figure, who can kill people as if they're measly ants. I can spare your life based on this fact alone." The dog hurriedly wagged its tail. However, Pei Qian didn't let go of the dog, saying, "You can escape death, but you can't escape harsh punishment." Pei Qian raised a hand, and Zhou Mili immediately handed her the hiking pole. After all, Pei Qian had previously stated that dog batons were needed to beat dogs, and the hiking pole would be even more effective when poking hornets' nests. However, Pei Qian immediately snapped the roasted seeds. Chan Rushu hurriedly placed a handful of roasted seeds in Pei Qian's hands. Pei Qian started to snack on the roasted seeds as she continued to twist the dog's mouth, saying, "Come on, give me a cold chuckle like those mighty figures." The dog pursed its mouth. "Let's try another one. Give me a wicked smile like those bad people in the Cultivation novels," Pei Qian ordered. The dog changed the look in its eyes and pursed its mouth again. Pei Qian frowned upon seeing this, and the dog immediately started to struggle. Knowing that things were going to take a turn for the worse, Pei Qian grabbed the dog and stood up, spinning one full rotation before throwing the dog more than 20 meters into the distance. She continued to snack on roasted seeds, and she saw a man and a young woman standing nearby. Pei Qian cocked her head, and after looking at them for a long time, a dazzling smile suddenly spread across her face as she bowed in respect. Qian Rushu bowed and greeted the man, calling him Mr. Zhou. Zhou merely followed her lead. "This is our second meeting, right?" Jiang Shangzhen looked at the tan little girl whom he had already found fairly interesting back then, saying with a wide smile, "You've now become Qian Ping'an's opening disciple? Very well. I feel like Qian Ping'an's judgment is very good, seeing that he was willing to bring you out of the lotus flower-blessed land." Pei Qian nodded earnestly in response. This person was quite good at sucking up to people. However, this person was truly very fortunate to become acquainted with her master. He needed to thank his ancestors and offer more incense. Thus, Pei Qian smiled and asked, "Senior, have you visited the mountain god temple at the mountain peak yet?" "Yes, I have," Jiang Shangzhen replied with a chuckle. "Then what about the Dragon Province's city god pavilion?" Pei Qian asked. The small incense person of the provincial city god could be regarded as half a lackey of hers now, since it was this incense person who had led Pei Qian to that large hornet nest back then. Afterward, Pei Qian had even rewarded the incense person with a single copper coin. In fact, the two of them had become acquainted far before the arrival of the provincial city god, and big sister Baoping had still been present at the time. However, this small incense person hadn't appeared much lately. Even so, Pei Qian still wanted to gain some additional incense offerings for the city god pavilion. Jiang Shangzhen shook his head and replied, "I genuinely haven't visited the provincial city god pavilion yet." After saying goodbye to Jiang Shangzhen, Pei Qian brought Qian Rushu and Zhou Mili to the top of the steps, where the three of them sat down. Xin Yuanji, the young girl whom Zhu Lian had brought to Downtrodden Mountain, was currently practicing fist techniques and walking from the waist of the mountain to the peak of the mountain. According to the words of Qian Rushu, the well-informed young steward in pink, Xin Yuanji needed to walk up and down these steps 3 times a day, with each trip involving a round trip from the foot of the mountain to the peak, and then back down again. The 3 young girls sat side by side, snacking on roasted seeds as they chatted quietly among themselves. Jiang Shangzhen returned to his courtyard, shaking his head and saying with a smile, "I finally know why the bright moon was stolen from the shoulder of that pure Confucian in the southern world continent. I surmise that the old temple master will also grab the large sun of the lotus flower-blessed land, extracting its essence and placing it in the other eye of that young girl." Yura was stunned by what she heard. Jiang Shangzhen glanced at her and asked, "Are you feeling very wronged and distressed? You're cultivating so earnestly, yet it seems like all of your cultivation pales in comparison to a single fated opportunity of someone else." Yura didn't dare to say anything. Jiang Shangzhen smiled with squinted eyes and retrieved a pseudo-celestial tool, the future premier treasure of the True Realm sect, continuing, "Are you able to hold this treasure if I sincerely give it to you? Will you not die? You will die, and you won't even know the reason behind your death. Will the culprit be Lu Laocheng? Or will it be Lu Jimao? Or perhaps those guest elders who came from the Jade Tablet sect? Some casual scheme from them will cause you to easily take the bait and walk into a death trap." Yara quietly waited for Jiang Shangzhen, the sect leader of the True Realm sect, to put away the pseudo-celestial tool. However, Jiang Shangzhen tightly gripped the jewel and slapped it into the young woman's glabella, saying with a faint smile, "Here a present for you, lest you mistakenly think that you can cultivate in peace and ride on a powerful person's coattail. This world is rife with predators and dangers, so how can you still be as clueless as you were in the lotus flower-blessed land? This won't do." Yura felt as if she were in a cauldron of boiling oil, with her soul being brutally scorched by the heat. She clutched her head and writhed in agony on the ground. Jiang Shangzhen had already waved his hand and created an isolated small world. "I'm going to use you to test the dispositions of Lu Laocheng and Lu Jimao. They're vagrant cultivators, after all, so I can understand their wild ambitions and their love for freedom. If they can resist the temptation, then it's only right that one of them advances to the immortal tier and one of them breaks through the barrier of the nascent tier, ascending to greater heights alongside me and enjoying the scenery together. If they can't resist the temptation, however, even if it's just a thought and only a minor action, then my heart will feel very pained. The True Realm sect will lose 2 powerful members for no good reason." Jiang Shangzhen sat down and crossed his legs, pouring himself a cup of tea as he continued. Almost no cultivators in the world have realized that only one's disposition can act as a Tao guardian that will accompany them for life. Die. In an impoverished alley in the capital of the Southern Garden Nation, a young boy in azure was sitting in the same chair as several years ago and thinking about some matters. When bidding farewell and leaving a few years ago, Mr. Liu had said that they could reunite in the outside world if the opportunity arose in the future. However, reuniting in this world would be impossible. Mr. Liu had already been the undisputed number 2 in the world at that time, with his strength almost identical to that of Yu Zheni, the old immortal of the Lake Mountain faction who had flown around on his sword and had the appearance of a young child. Not only that, but Dragon General Tang Che had also led the army of the Northern Jian Nation on an expedition to the north, conquering the plains and accumulating outstanding military merit. Afterward, Tang Che and the army of the Northern Jian Nation had chosen to ease their advance, allowing the plains to descend into severe internal conflict, where sons killed their fathers and brothers killed brothers. Moreover, Tang Che had ventured north with nothing but his saber refiner several times, killing countless powerful figures of the plains. After visiting the Southern Garden Nation, armed sage Cheng Yuanshan abandoned all of his wealth and properties in the plains for some unknown reason, choosing to join the Lake Mountain faction instead. Meanwhile, the Pine Song Nation started to aggressively search for people with cultivation aptitude under the rule of the new emperor, a puppet installed and backed by the Lake Mountain faction. Meanwhile, both Lu Feng's Bird's Eye View Peak and Zhou Shi's Spring Tide Palace remained closed off the entire time. The young boy in azure silently observed these great trends of the world. However, he still spent more of his time reading and cultivating. Mr. Zhong Qiu and Mr. Liu had each accompanied Chao Qinglang to the 5 mountains of the Southern Garden Nation one time. These were distant journeys, and they were also a form of cultivation. Chao Qinglang had been in possession of the 5 Mountains True Appearance picture scroll at the time. Imperial Preceptor Zhong Qiu had attempted to destroy this immortal item in the past, worried that Yu Zheni would snatch it away. However, he had failed to destroy the picture scroll no matter what, and Mr. Liu had somehow managed to convince him to give the immortal item to Chao Qinglang afterward, asking the young boy to look after it. Chao Qinglang was able to guess some of the reasons. In reality, Mr. Liu was targeting Yu Zheni both for his sake, and for the sake of this extremely mystical immortal item. The knowledge that these two teachers had imparted to Chao Qinglang was also slightly different. The knowledge imparted by Mr. Zhong Qiu was gradual and progressive, filled with a rich background of etiquette. After all, Zhong Qiu was reputed as a scholarly imperial preceptor and a martial arts grandmaster. On the other hand, the knowledge imparted by Lu Tai was varied and profound. At the same time, his sudden appearance and rapid rise in this world were also unrivaled in history. Without exception, all of his disciples had risen to become mighty figures who dominated a region. There was a knock on the door. Chao Qinglang walked over to answer. It was an old Confucian scholar with graying sideburns. He was none other than the imperial preceptor of the Southern Garden Nation. Zhong Qiu and Chao Qinglang, his half-disciple, both sat down. Zhong Qiu smiled and said, "Qinglang, you had many questions when you were young, asking about the origin of the stars, the cycle of the sun and moon, the source of the wind and rain, and many more. As your teacher, I'm unable to answer some of these questions, so you can seek the answers yourself in the future." Chao Qinglang nodded lightly. Zhong Qiu fell silent for a moment before remarking with emotion, "But I hope you can speak up for this world in the future, preventing it from transforming into a go board where everyone is reduced to nothing but a disposable piece." "I will," Chao Qinglang replied. "This is somewhat related to the level of my abilities in the future, but it isn't all that important. Moreover, I have trust in him." "Then I feel at ease," Zhong Qiu said with a smile. He felt at ease with this young boy in azure whom he had watched study and grow up year by year, and he also felt at ease with that young man who had dressed in white and carried a sword. Zhong Qiu suddenly felt slightly hesitant. "Mr. Zhong, are you hesitating about whether to stay in the Southern Garden Nation or whether to leave and go to that world?" Chao Qinglang asked. Zhong Qiu nodded and replied, "I'm not curious about how big the outside world is, but I feel a slight yearning for the sagely knowledge of the outside world." A dazzling smile spread across Chao Qinglang's face as he said, "Rest assured, Mr. Zhong," he said before, "that the books outside aren't very expensive. Just how old were you at that time? Yet, you seem to remember everything he said to you back then, Zhongqiu teased. How can I possibly forget? I won't ever forget, Chao Qinglang murmured. The two of them fell silent. Zhongqiu glanced up at the sky and said, It's about to rain. The path is still present, so an umbrella will suffice, Chao Qinglang replied with a faint smile. Die. Mr. Fisherman Wu Shuowen had left Blusher Prefecture with his two disciples, Zhao Wan and her older brother Zhao Shuxia, and started to journey around the world. After all, the commotion at Misty Mountain had been far too big, so it wasn't that Wu Shuowen didn't have faith in Chen Ping'an, but it was always better to be safe than sorry. Because of this, they had embarked on a distant journey and left Colorful Garment Nation. They had first traveled to the Water Combing Nation and visited Sword Saint Song Yushao. Wu Shuowen and Song Yushao had gotten along quite well, but it couldn't be said that they were like old friends. This couldn't be helped. After all, it wasn't the case that a friend's friend would definitely become a very good friend. Some things were down to fate. However, Song Yushao liked the two youths very much, and Song Yushao's daughter-in-law, who was now managing the clan affairs, sincerely liked Luan Luan, the young girl who was clearly a cultivation talent. In fact, even blind people could tell that she was a cultivation talent. The old man and the two youths started to return north. This was because the further south they traveled, the more dangerous things would become. Wu Shuowen didn't dare to risk the lives of the two children. On this day, the three of them camped out in the open atop a mountain peak, and Zhao Wan was cultivating while Zhao Shuxia was practicing walking meditation. Wu Shuowen was extremely satisfied as he watched on. Luan Luan's cultivation aptitude was naturally better, but Wu Shuowen never showed any favoritism between the two children. In reality, Wu Shuowen was also in possession of a secret scripture, the proper sword scripture, which Chen Ping'an had personally made a copy of character by character. There was also the great replica Chu Huang that he was temporarily carrying on his back. However, Wu Shuowen hadn't revealed anything to Zhao Shuxia yet. According to his agreement with Chen Ping'an, Wu Shuowen should only hand these two items to Zhao Shuxia whenever he achieved initial mastery in fist techniques. After practicing fist techniques, Zhao Shuxia stood still and gazed into the distance. At Blusher Prefecture, he had met Mr. Chen again after a long time, but he had only thrown approximately 163,000 punches at the time. When bidding farewell, Mr. Chen had told him to practice up to 500,000 punches. Zhao Shuxia knew that his aptitude was bad, so he put his head down and practiced the fist technique in earnest, hoping to make up for his shortcomings with hard work. At some unknown time, Zhao Wan walked up to him and asked in a gentle voice, "Big brother, do you want to become Mr. Chen's disciple?" Zhao Shuxia scratched his head and replied in embarrassment, "I don't dare to think about it." How could he, Zhao Shuxia, dare to dream about becoming the disciple of a sword immortal like Mr. Chen? "But big brother, I have a nagging feeling that Mr. Chen has very high hopes for you," Zhao Wan whispered in secret. Zhao Shuxia thought for a moment before replying, "We can ignore these things for the moment. I definitely need to throw 500,000 punches, and then we can discuss these things again in the future." Zhao Wan nodded in response. Zhao Shuxia suddenly heaved a sigh. "What's wrong?" Zhao Wan asked in puzzlement. "Say, what if I'm fortunate enough to become Mr. Chen's disciple in the future? How should I refer to you at that time? Master's missus? Things will become quite messy at that time, no?" Zhao Shuxia asked quietly. Zhao Wan flushed bright red, with her cheeks appearing like brilliant cherry blossoms blooming beautifully in the spring wind. She kicked Zhao Shuxia in the calf and exclaimed, "Zhao Shuxia, what nonsense are you spewing?" Zhao Shuxia grimaced with an innocent expression. "I didn't hear anything at all," Wu Shuowen said loudly. The young girl blushed even more, and she ran into the distance to calm down by herself. Zhao Shuxia turned around and exchanged a smile with Wu Shuowen, with everything between them communicated wordlessly. Even though their ages were very different, they were ultimately both men after all. However, things became different when Zhao Shuxia started to practice fist techniques again. There were times when Wu Shuowen would become slightly adrift as he watched the young boy practicing fist techniques in a monotone manner, feeling like Zhao Shuxia's aptitude was actually very good. In the past, Zhao Shuxia indeed hadn't been a martial arts talent, and right now, his fist intent was still shallow. and he still couldn't be regarded as a martial arts prodigy. However, as long as Zhao Xuxia persevered and continued along this path, there would eventually come a day when the young boy could at least have a chance to turn things around. Who in the world had the most similar fist intent to Qian Pingyan? It was none other than the young and unknown Zhao Xuxia. At the border of the Azure Phoenix Nation, the Dao heart of immortal-colored glaze was almost about to collapse. Great esteemed immortal Cui, who was dressed in white and appeared like a young boy, was instructing a frail little child to carry him around on his back. The little child swayed back and forth as he walked along a rugged mountain path. Cui Dongshan waved his snow-white sleeve around and continued to shout "Giddy up," making it seem like he was riding a horse. On the second floor of the bamboo building, Pei Qian had just dodged a punch with much difficulty when the next punch struck her in the forehead, pushing her into the wall and nailing her in place. Cui Chong, the barefoot old man, was expressionless as he said, "You're at the 3rd tier, and I'm facing off against you as the weakest type of 4th tier cultivator. Yet how many times have you essentially died already? Are you a useless piece of trash? If your master was a piece of trash with decent aptitude, then you're a piece of trash who doesn't have the right to be Qian Pingyan's disciple." Pei Qian, who was seemingly hanging on the wall, was bleeding from all orifices on her face. She summoned all her energy to open her eyes and spit a mouthful of blood at the old man. Cui Cheng didn't dodge, and he simply exerted more force through his fist. If this bamboo building were an ordinary building, then Pei Qian's head would have sunk completely into the wall already. "You're not willing to yield," the old man chuckled coldly. "But do you have the ability to open your mouth to speak? Trash disciple taught by a trash master. If I were Qian Pingyan, I would have told you to grab your belongings and piss off a long time ago, lest you bring even more embarrassment in the future." His fist smashed into Pei Qian's bloody face, causing her tanned appearance to no longer be visible. A skinny arm shakily reached up, lightly tapping Cui Cheng on the shoulder. This couldn't even be considered a punch. Was this light brush supposed to tickle him? Cui Cheng seemingly flared up in rage, with his fist transforming into a palm as he grabbed Pei Qian's head and casually flung her sideways, sending her crashing into a wall before thudding heavily to the ground. Pei Qian had already lost consciousness. Cui Cheng walked over to her side and squatted down, extending a finger and making a tapping motion in the air. He stood up a moment later, turning to the corridor outside the bamboo building and instructing, "Drag her out." The bamboo door swung open, and Chan Rushu deftly picked up Pei Qian and placed the tanned young girl on her back, after which she gently but quickly ran to the 1st floor of the bamboo building. The old man clasped his hands behind his back and strode out of the room, walking to the railings lining the corridor. He laughed soundlessly, appearing as satisfied and delighted as could be. That punch, Pei Qian deserved to be the strongest at her tier. Qian Pingyan continued to make his way along the vast river that led into the sea, traveling in the upstream direction. He didn't try to stay particularly close to the riverbank, making no effort to ensure that he could see the river at all times. After all, he had to carefully examine the local customs and traditions of the places that he passed through, as well as visit various sects and mountain and water deities. As a result, he often had to take a longer route than the shortest available one, and he wasn't traveling very quickly. He had always been like this whenever he decided to do something, willing and able to withstand all manners of rigors and hardships. He was like a safe harbor, providing shelter to all those around him. He had always possessed tremendous patience and resilience, perhaps due to his rough upbringing. On his journey, Qian Pingyan encountered something that was rather thought-provoking. One night, he was staying in an inn near a certain prefectural city god temple in the sacred Lotus Nation when, at around midnight, a loud cacophony of percussion instruments audible only to cultivators and ghostly beings rang out. The underworld suddenly opened up, and all of the nearby ghosts and spirits were guided into the prefectural city by all manners of errand ghost and underworld emissaries in an orderly fashion. The semi-monthly City God Night Assembly was taking place, and it was also known as the City God Night Trials, during which the City God would judge all of the entities his territory on their merits and transgressions. Qian Pingyan slipped out of the inn and arrived outside the City God Temple. The day and night wandering deities were standing at the entrance, serving as door gods, and they immediately extended respectful bows at the sight of Qian Pingyan. Qian Pingan cupped his fist to return their salute, then asked if he could listen in on the city god's night trials. The day-wandering deity immediately entered the temple to relay Qian Pingan's request to the city god, and upon securing approval from the city god, the scholarly and martial judges, and the 3 assistant officials from the Yin-Yang division, Qian Pingan was invited into the temple. The city god was seated behind a large table with the 2 judges and the 3 assistant officials standing behind him in an orderly formation, passing judgment upon the ghosts and spirits inside. Anyone dissatisfied by their rulings and hadn't committed any clearly heinous crimes were permitted to appeal to the nearby mountain and river gods, at which point those mountain and river gods would send their own underworld emissaries to reassess their cases. The city god had ordered for a chair to be brought out for Qian Pingan, but he moved the chair to behind a pillar, and only then did he sit down upon it, seemingly resting with his eyes closed. Only when a Yin entity began loudly expressing their dissent toward their ruling did Qian Pingan open his eyes to listen to how the city god was going to respond. The Yin entity in question had been a Confucian scholar during his living days, but hadn't received any official scholarly honors. He had once unintentionally dug up a mass burial site outside the prefectural city, and he had exhumed the sets of human remains inside before properly burying them one by one. The Yin entity felt like this was an act of significant merit, and he questioned why the city god had completely disregarded this when, in his opinion, this should have been enough to make up for his transgressions. He was determined to raise an appeal to the river god, and if that didn't work, he would put his chance at entering the cycle of reincarnation on the line to raise the matter even further to the central mountain god of the sacred Lotus Nation. He was convinced that the mountain god was corrupt and unjust, and he was determined to stand up for himself. It has always been our policy to not reward meritorious acts made purely with the intention of accumulating good karma for oneself, and to not punish inadvertent transgressions made with no purposeful intent, the city god countered. Your case is one that's extremely clear-cut, and even if you raise this matter to the central mountain god, his ruling won't be any different. The Yin entity lowered his head in a defeated manner. The night trials drew to a conclusion on the cusp of first light. Qian Pingan rose to his feet, then made his way around the pillar to stand in the, where he expressed his gratitude to the city god before departing. The city god personally escorted him to the entrance of the temple, and once there, he hesitated momentarily before asking, "Was it you who cleared out that path down the mountain for the slaves of the winding river prefecture tasked with venturing into the mountains to collect imperial wood?" "That was indeed me," Qian Pingan confirmed with a nod. "The path was very perilous to traverse, so I took pity on them and decided to make the conditions a little easier. 2 of those people should have died on the return trip down the mountain," the city god sighed. "One of them should have been crushed to death by a log, while the other was destined to fall to his death off a cliff. By clearing out that path, you've saved 2 lives. Do you think this was more of a meritorious act or more of a disruption of karma?" "The fact that you're asking me this question tells me that it was most likely the latter," Qian Pingan said with a smile. The city god observed Qian Pingan for a moment, then smiled as he said, "You're a wise man. Unlike humans, deities were able to see beyond the exterior to peer directly into the hearts of others. People's actions are like flowing rivers," the city god sighed. "A river can nourish the fields and provide food for countless people, but it could just as easily turn into a torrential flood that kills just as many people. There is a very fine line between merit and fault, and one could turn into the other in the blink of an eye. As a cultivator, you must be particularly aware of this. Of course, I am just a minor deity whose words hold no weight, so please do not allow your mental state to be disrupted by me. Otherwise, I will have committed a severe transgression myself." Qian Pingan thanked the city god once again, and upon returning to the inn, he ignited the lamp on the table, then began transcribing the 1-page Buddhist scripture as a means of calming his own mental state. After completing his transcription, he stowed the scripture away alongside his writing utensils. As first light arrived, he blew out the lamp and made his way over to the window. Upon closer examination, one would discover that the rules laid out by mountain and river deities were quite far removed from the rules of Confucianism. The former didn't correspond at all with conventional ideas of good and evil, and as Qian Pingan continued to walk down the path of cultivation, this was something that he had to grow accustomed to. At the moment he was actually in a very good mood. Having traveled so far, he had added many items to his collection, and he was very much looking forward to seeing the future downtrodden mountain. While a lone flower could be quite beautiful, a flourishing floral garden was what Qian Ping'an truly wanted to see. After leaving the prefectural city, Qian Ping'an continued to travel through the sacred lotus nation. He wasn't wearing his jade hairpin or his conical bamboo hat. However, his bamboo case remained on his back, and he was still holding his bamboo hiking pole. On this day, Qian Ping'an entered a waterside temple to offer up some incense, and as he did so, he spotted a 1,000-year-old cypress tree that would have taken 7 or 8 grown men holding hands with their arms extended to fully encircle. Its canopy hung over half of the entire plaza, and beside it was a stone plaque bearing a passage of text written by a renowned scholar of the sacred lotus nation. The local authorities had spent a great deal of money hiring an exceptional artisan to engrave the plaque, and even though it was very new, it had a very antiquated appearance. Only after reading the text on the plaque would one come to understand just how many ordeals the cypress tree had withstood to still be standing to this day. Qian Ping'an had taken a liking to the contents of the plaque, so he pulled out his writing utensils from his bamboo bookcase, then used the bookcase as a desk to transcribe the contents of the plaque word for word. It was a very long passage of text, and Qian Ping'an was taking great care in his transcription, so before he knew it, it was already nighttime. The temple had a nightly curfew, but the temple attendant didn't ask Qian Ping'an to leave. Instead, he and a small child carried a pair of stools over into the courtyard, then placed them on either side of the plaque and set a pair of lit lamps upon them to illuminate the plaque. Each lamp was enveloped within a thin veil that didn't obstruct the light, but ensured that the lamps wouldn't be extinguished by the wind. Qian Ping'an hurriedly stopped what he was doing upon seeing this, then rose to his feet to bow to the temple attendant in gratitude. The old temple attendant smiled and gestured for him to continue, then told him that there were rooms in the temple that visitors could stay in overnight. He then issued some instructions to the small child, and the latter sank down to his haunches, holding a key in his hand while nodding off for sporadic naps. The child was very bored, so he began observing Qian Ping'an's transcriptions while standing behind him. In his eyes, Qian Ping'an's handwriting couldn't be referred to as good or bad. However, he was very meticulous and his transcriptions were very neat. Aside from that, there were no other merits to his writing. He had once visited another temple, and that one had been far more spectacular than this one. Its walls were riddled with inscriptions from renowned scholars, all of which were exceptionally elegant. The centerpiece was an entire wall full of text written in cursive script, left behind by a renowned scholar in a drunken state. It was truly a sight for sore eyes, and even though it was only a passage of text casually written out on a wall, it was considered sacred in the literati world of the sacred lotus nation. In contrast, Qian Ping'an's handwriting was downright mediocre. After completing his transcriptions, Qian Ping'an packed his writing utensils back into his bamboo case, then hoisted it onto his back as he made his way into one of the guest rooms. As for how he was going to express his gratitude to the temple attendant, he decided that the best way to do so would be to make a large donation when he left the next day. The child was yawning incessantly, and he felt like he could fall asleep even while on his feet, but he didn't complain that Qian Ping'an was taking too long. There were many engraved stone plaques and written wall passages in the temple, so it was often the case that scholars would come here to make transcriptions. Despite his young age, the child was very experienced when it came to attending to guests. Furthermore, the old temple attendant had a strange personality and had always given scholars preferential treatment. According to his senior brothers in the temple, the old temple attendant had attended to countless scholars who had traveled here for sightseeing or were on their way to the capital to attend the imperial examination. However, it seemed that their temple wasn't blessed by much fortune, and even after so many years, not a single one of the visiting scholars had excelled in the imperial examinations and gone on to become high-ranking officials. In contrast, all of the other temples were able to boast about stories of visits from scholars who went on to achieve lofty positions in the officialdom. Qian Ping'an made his way into the corridor, then stopped in his tracks as he turned back to look at the ancient cypress tree. In the moonlit breeze the branch sways, much like a treasured sword's gleaming rays. He murmured to himself. "That's a fine poem, young master," the child remarked. "Where did you see it?" "I forget where I read it," Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. If only you had come up with that on the spot, the child said in a forlorn manner. That way, we would have been able to engrave that phrase onto the walls of our temple to further add to our collection. Chen Ping'an cast his gaze toward the cypress tree and shook his head. The child mistook this as a gesture from Chen Ping'an indicating that the poem wasn't an original one that he had come up with himself, so he quickly lost interest and said, Please come with me, young master. I'll take you to the guest room so you can rest for the night. It's not a big room, but it's very clean. I've been looking after all of the guest rooms, and I assure you that you won't even find half an ant inside. The child lowered his voice here as he implored. If you do, please don't report me to the temple attendant. Chen Ping'an nodded in response with an amused smile, then followed the child into the guest room. Within the ancient cypress tree was a wood spirit that was on the cusp of attaining a human form, and it was so frustrated that it was on the verge of tears. It was itching to grab the clueless child and give him a firm knock to the head. You foolish child! Do you know how massive a fated opportunity the temple has just missed out on because of you? If that sword immortal had been invited to personally inscribe that poem onto the walls of the temple, the tree spirit would have benefited immensely, elevating it to unprecedented heights. Of course, the fortune of the temple would also be enhanced to an unfathomable extent. Even the most meticulous inscriptions made by the most powerful officials of the sacred Lotus Nation couldn't begin to compare with a casual inscription made by this almighty sword immortal. However, it didn't dare to say anything as the exalted immortal had shaken his head at it just now. That night, Chen Ping'an continued to perform his six-step walking meditation, while also complementing it with standing and sleeping meditation. His fist intent coursed through his entire body in a half-asleep state, allowing him to rest and cultivate simultaneously. All of a sudden, he sensed a slight disturbance, but his eyes remained closed as he continued his walking meditation. That night, the old temple attendant dreamed of an azure-robed man carrying an ancient cypress branch on his back, much like a wandering hero carrying a sword. The man told the temple attendant that he was the manifestation of the cypress tree in the courtyard of the temple, and he implored the temple attendant to request the guest that was staying the night to leave behind an inscription. The azure-robed man was extremely earnest in his pleas, so much so that he brought himself to the verge of tears. The temple attendant awoke from his sleep with a start, and he heaved a faint sigh, seemingly reluctant to carry out the tree spirit's request. In his eyes, if the young scholar wanted to leave behind an inscription, then he would do so even without being requested, and if he didn't want to bless the temple with an inscription, then the temple attendant would be putting him in a difficult position by making such a request. However, he was feeling quite conflicted. There had been many stories of the ancient cypress tree performing supernatural feats to protect the temple in the past, so he felt like he, along with his predecessors, were all indebted to the tree spirit. With that in mind, he put on his robes and boots, then made his way to Chen Ping'an's guest room. However, after much hesitation, he decided against knocking on the door. Instead, he strode over to the cypress tree and said, "My apologies, Cypress Immortal, but I am unable to carry out your request. The actions and decisions of immortals are unfathomable to mere mortals like myself, and he must have his reasons for not leaving behind an inscription of his own accord." A forlorn sigh rang out from the cypress tree, but the tree spirit made no effort to change the temple attendant's mind. Only now did Chen Ping'an finally cease his walking meditation as a faint smile appeared on his face. In the blink of an eye, he appeared beside the temple attendant and said, "It's fine, I'm happy to fulfill your request." The ancient cypress spirit appeared in the form of an azure-robed man, but its body was very indistinct and hazy as it was still yet to fully attain a human form. It knelt down and kowtowed to the ground as it said in an emotional voice, "Thank you, exalted immortal." The temple attendant hurriedly turned to bow to Chen Ping'an in gratitude as well, but Chen Ping'an reached out to stop him while accepting the tree spirit's gesture of gratitude. This wasn't because he regarded the tree spirit as inferior to humans. Instead, he felt justified in accepting this gesture of gratitude from it as he had bestowed upon it a monumental fated opportunity. After observing the city-got-night trials, Chen Ping'an had been struck by a flash of enlightenment, one that had allowed him to completely understand something. If a cultivator wished to have a clear mind, then they had to address the factors clouding their mind at their roots. Qian Ping'an told the temple attendant and the cypress spirit to wait for him for a moment, then made a trip back to his guest room and pulled out a sheet of golden talisman paper. Only after taking a moment to hone his concentration did he meticulously write down the phrase from earlier onto the piece of talisman paper. After that, he hoisted his bamboo case onto his back, then returned to the cypress tree and handed the talisman to the azure-robed man. You can bury this talisman where the roots of your tree and in the roots of the mountain meet, and you can slowly refine it from there. The pursuit of the great Tao is always an unpredictable endeavor, and the only constant that you can ensure is yourself. Be good to the world, and the world will reciprocate you in kind. The azure-robed man accepted the golden talisman with both hands, and he burst into tears of gratitude as he kowtowed to Qian Ping'an once again. With that, Qian Ping'an departed from the temple, choosing not to stay the night. He turned back to discover that the temple attendant and the cypress spirit were still watching him from afar, and he gave them a farewell wave before continuing on his way. He was in a good mood, having just saved himself from having to make a large donation. A smile appeared on his face as he continued onward, practicing his six-step walking meditation as he made his way through the night. Everyone had their own fate. Qian Ping'an's visit had become a massive fated opportunity for the temple, but if he had visited some other temple under a different set of circumstances, perhaps he wouldn't have felt inclined to leave them with anything. However, that didn't mean that the other temples couldn't encounter other fated opportunities elsewhere. There were countless paths to the top when it came to the pursuit of the great Tao, so an encounter between people walking the same path was an extremely rare occurrence. At a later point, Qian Ping'an stopped by the great river somewhere in the territory of the sacred Lotus Nation's central mountain, and he began fishing by the river with an old man. The old man was a qi refiner, but not one of a particularly lofty cultivation base, perhaps the sea observation tier or the Dragon Gate tier. However, he was certainly making a very big scene. He was accompanied by many maidservants and child attendants, and he had prepared a long row of fishing rods, as well as numerous large pots that were laden with bait, surely enough to completely stuff even the largest fish in the river. The old fisherman determined that Qian Ping'an seemed to have been a 4th or 5th tier pure martial artist, and he was happy to have the company of a fellow fishing enthusiast, so he instructed one of his maidservants to deliver to Qian Ping'an one of his large pots of bait. The maidservant told Qian Ping'an that her master was always very generous to any fisherman that he met, so he could accept the pot of bait without any qualms. She also told him that it was difficult to hook onto big fish unless burley was laid down first. Qian Ping'an nodded vehemently in agreement with this sentiment, and he proclaimed that the old man had to have been an expert fisherman. Despite the maidservant's reassurances, Qian Ping'an still felt a little indebted to the old man for accepting such a large pot of bait from him, so he asked the old man for his Tao title. "My friends all like to call me the sea-filling Taoist," the old man declared with a wide smile. Qian Ping'an took a glance at the large pots of bait, and he could certainly understand why the old man had been given such a Tao title. As the session wore on, the old man was constantly reeling in one fish after another, but the big fish that he desired continued to prove elusive. At around dusk, a giant luchuan passed through, and the deck was packed with armor-clad soldiers. The luchuan was crashing through the waves with tremendous power, causing a massive commotion. The old man immediately began cursing loudly at the luchuan, denouncing them for scaring all the fish away. An imposing general clad in a suit of dew armor emerged from the luchuan with an iron spear in his grasp, glowering intently at the old fisherman. "That seems to be General Gao Ling of the Sacred Lotus Nation, and he's wearing a suit of precious divine dew-bearing armor," one of the maidservants cautioned in a concerned manner. "Shoot!" the old man exclaimed as he stomped a foot in frustration. "I heard he's got a terrible temper. Fetch the rods, we have to get out of here." Over on the luchuan, a woman appeared by General Gao Ling's side, and he lowered his head to discuss something with her briefly, then leaped onto the railing of the luchuan as he turned a hostile gaze back to the old fisherman. Qian Ping'an slowly withdrew his fishing rod. The brief exchange between the general and the woman on the luchuan had been clearly audible to him. The general had told the woman that the old fisherman was a vagrant cultivator from a foreign nation with the Tao title of sea-filling Taoist. Apparently, he was a very lazy cultivator whose combat prowess was well below the standard of his Dragon Gate tier cultivation base. Intrigued, The woman told Gao Ling to go and teach the old man a lesson. She told him that there was no need to kill him, but to give him a real beating, then find an opportunity to see if he could recruit him to her manor to serve as a guest elder. Gao Ling was rather hesitant, telling the woman that the sea-filling Taoist had already turned down the several invitations from the emperor of the Azure Jade Nation to serve as a guest elder of the imperial court, so he was most likely not going to accept her offer. The woman merely nodded in response, seemingly having relented, but Gao Ling immediately knew what had to be done. The Sacred Lotus Nation wasn't a particularly powerful nation, but it had an extraordinarily powerful backer, and this woman had very close ties with the backer in question. Gao Ling appeared to have been no more than 30 years of age, but he was actually already 60. He was only a third-rank official in the Sacred Lotus Nation officialdom, but he was the most powerful warrior in the officialdom, and he knew that if he could fulfill the woman's request, then that could well be enough for him to receive a promotion to the second rank. With that in mind, he yelled, "Where are you going in such a hurry? Why not come aboard and have a drink?" He then launched himself off the railing, doing so with such force that the entire Luchuan lurched to the side, and all of the armor-clad soldiers on board had to frantically grab onto the railing to prevent themselves from being thrown overboard. Gao Ling landed on the surface of the river, then began treading water toward the shore as he thrust his spear forward. However, before he had a chance to reach the shore, he saw a blur flash before his eyes, following which he felt a gentle but firm impact against his chest, sending him flying back to the Luchuan. As it turned out, the young fisherman beside the sea-filling Taoist had suddenly swooped onto the scene, arriving before Gao Ling in the blink of an eye. From there, he thrust a palm into Gao Ling's chest, sending him flying back to the Luchuan even faster than he had come.